Tonight's story is the result of dedicated research and patient effort behind the scenes. Every detail has been carefully chosen to create a soothing listening experience while honoring the reality of the events being told. This channel exists to give lasting attention to stories that history nearly allowed to fade away. He held the keys to your front door, your storage unit, and your life, and he used every single one of them. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. This evening, we uncover 3 disturbing cases where the truth lurked far beneath a harmless surface. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the locksmith who opened graves, James Richard Curry, aka the Storage Yard Slayer, the predator who preyed on those who trusted him most. Now let's begin. There is a particular kind of evil that does not announce itself. It does not lurk in shadowed alleyways wearing the face of a monster. It does not come wrapped in warning signs or draped in obvious menace. No, the most dangerous predators in recorded criminal history have always hidden behind the banal, the ordinary, the neighborly. They shake your hand at the hardware store. They help you move your belongings into a locker. They sit at your Christmas party drinking punch, smiling, laughing, passing the cheese dip. And while you laugh back, while you relax, while you trust, they are already deciding which of those gathered in that room will never leave it alive. James Richard Curry was that kind of man. A locksmith, a storage yard manager, a neighbor, a familiar face in a small California community where people left their doors unlocked because they knew each other. He was the man people called when they needed access, when they were locked out, when they needed someone reliable, someone competent, someone safe. But behind the eyes of that seemingly unremarkable man, a man who looked like someone's quiet uncle, someone's harmless coworker, there existed a calculating, cold-blooded predator who sexually assaulted women and executed people with a single, unhesitating bullet to the skull. A man who stuffed corpses into wooden crates and drove along California highways with the bodies of his victims rotting behind him. A man who confessed to multiple murders, expressed zero remorse, and then, before any courtroom could strip him of his power, fashioned a makeshift noose out of whatever his cell contained and hanged himself, robbing justice of its final word. And even in death, he left riddles. A woman on a Nevada hiking trail with no name, no identity, and a bullet wound in the back of her head. A coworker who vanished without explanation, whose remains have never been recovered to this day. Cold cases stretching across California and Nevada like the roots of a poisonous tree, reaching into the soil of decades, refusing to fully die. This is the story of James Richard Curry, the Storage Yard Slayer, and it is a story that took nearly 4 decades, cutting-edge forensic genealogy, 2,000 hours of investigative labor, and the DNA of his own children to finally tell in full. Strap in, because the full weight of what this man did, and who he did it to, deserves to be understood in every suffocating, unsettling detail. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The town of Behar, Texas, in November of 1946 was nothing extraordinary. A dusty, working-class pocket of the American South, where the rhythms of daily life moved slowly and secrets were kept quietly. It was into this unremarkable world that James Richard Curry entered on the 16th of that month, carried into existence by circumstances that were, from the very beginning, layered in secrecy and shame. He was illegitimate, born of an affair between 2 people from Dallas who had no intention of building a life together. His father walked away. His mother, left holding the weight of a child she had not planned for, chose to raise him, but not under his father's name. She gave him a different surname entirely, a choice that would, decades later, complicate investigators' efforts to trace his bloodline through the labyrinthine corridors of forensic genealogy. What we know about Curry's childhood is, by almost any measure, nearly nothing. The historical record on his early years is sparse to the point of near total silence. No documented school records of note have entered the public domain. No former classmates stepping forward with chilling recollections. No childhood neighbors describing disturbing behavior in the backyard. In that absence of information lies something profoundly unsettling, because with killers of Curry's caliber, the silence of the early years rarely means there was nothing wrong. It usually means no one was watching closely enough to document it. What we do know is that by the time he reached his late 20s, Curry had already chosen the criminal path. Sometime during the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, a period of enormous social upheaval in America, when law enforcement was stretched thin and the country's attention was turned toward protests, assassinations, and war, James Richard Curry was arrested in Texas for robbery and assault. These were not minor infractions. Robbery implies confrontation. Assault implies violence. The willingness to overpower another human being, to take what does not belong to you through force or threat, is not a character quirk. It is a declaration of intent. And the courts recognized it as such. He was sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment at the Huntsville Unit, one of the most notorious correctional facilities in the entire state of Texas, a place with a grim and storied history that stretched back to the 1800s. The Huntsville Unit had seen the worst of humanity pass through its walls, and it was there that James Richard Curry spent years behind bars, in a facility that rarely reformed its residents and more often hardened them into something colder, more calculated, and more certain in the willingness to destroy other lives. The 20-year sentence, however, did not run its full course. By 1977, Curry had earned his release, whether through good behavior, parole, or the broader corrections policies of the era. The record does not specify in precise detail. What it does tell us is that the moment he walked out of that prison, James Richard Curry did not linger in Texas. He had no reason to. Texas held nothing for him except the ghost of a sentence served and the memory of a childhood lived under a borrowed name. He packed what little he had and he drove west. California, the land of reinvention. The state where, since the gold rush, people had come to shed old identities and construct new ones. The mythology of the West had always been about starting over, about leaving the past behind a horizon line that never quite caught up with you. For James Richard Curry, California was not a dream, it was a strategy. A fresh landscape where nobody knew his face, his record, or his predilections. Where a man with 20 years of prison sharpening his edges could present himself as simply another working man, another face in the crowd of a state teeming with millions. He settled in Joaquina, a small, quiet agricultural community in Tulare County in California's Central Valley. If you have never heard of Joaquina, that is because it barely registers on the map. A blink-and-miss hamlet surrounded by flat farmland and the particular kind of small-town proximity that means everyone knows everyone else's car, everyone's schedule, everyone's dog. It was precisely the kind of place where a man freshly released from a Texas penitentiary could walk into a local business, present himself as hardworking and capable, and be taken at face value. Nobody runs a background check on the new locksmith. Nobody asks about the 2 decades in between. And so Curry found employment. He began working for a locksmithing company in the area, a profession that, in retrospect, reveals its own dark irony. Locksmiths are trusted with the most intimate architecture of people's lives. They make keys. They solve the problem of access. They are invited into homes when families are locked out, into businesses when security needs updating, into people's most private spaces when those spaces need to be opened and closed again. A locksmith, by the nature of the trade, possesses knowledge that most people do not, the knowledge of how locks work, which locks are weak, which doors can be bypassed, and how entry can be gained into places that are supposed to be secure. In the hands of an honest professional, this knowledge is a service. In the hands of James Richard Curry, it would become something far more sinister. It was through this work, this daily, ordinary professional existence, that Curry began to build his network of acquaintances and, more critically, his list of future victims. And the first name on that list, the name that would never be tied to a recovered body, belonged to a man named James DeWitt Robinson. Robinson was 40 years old, also a locksmith, and the two men knew each other through professional proximity in the tight-knit Joaquina community. He was, by most accounts, a quiet individual without enemies. Exactly the kind of person who might trust a colleague without question. But Robinson had something that Curry wanted. He had recently received a settlement of $10,000 from a personal injury lawsuit filed in 1976, and beyond that, he was involved in property dealings in Tulare County. In Curry's world, those facts were not biographical trivia, they were an opportunity. Sometime in 1978, 1 year after Curry arrived in California, while the wounds of his prison years were still fresh and his hunger for control and acquisition was sharpest, James DeWitt Robinson simply vanished. There was no last known sighting accompanied by witnesses, no dramatic confrontation observed by a neighbor, no blood-soaked discovery in a field. He was there and then he was not. And because nobody reported him missing at the time, because his disappearance was not understood as a disappearance but simply as an absence, no investigation was launched. No missing persons report. No search party. No detectives knocking on doors. The machinery of justice that might have caught James Richard Curry early, in 1978, before more blood was spilled, simply did not turn because nobody turned the key. Robinson's fate remained unknown for years, and would remain officially unconfirmed forever, because his body was never found. What investigators would later discover, after Curry's arrest in 1983, was something that pointed unmistakably toward murder. Locked inside a storage unit that Curry controlled in Santa Clara County, police found a .38 caliber handgun registered to James DeWitt Robinson. They found checkbooks bearing his name, legal documents, personal identification, items that no living person voluntarily surrenders, items that no thief typically keeps for 5 years in a private storage locker, items that suggested in the starkest possible terms that James Robinson had not simply drifted away to start a new life somewhere. He had almost certainly been killed, his money taken, and his belongings stored like trophies in a metal-walled container on De La Cruz Boulevard. But without a body, the law could not say for certain. And without certainty, the case remained suspended, a confirmed suspicion, an unconfirmable crime. Following the likely murder of Robinson, Curry continued to build his California life with an almost unsettling deliberateness. Sometime in the early 1980s, he leveraged enough resources, perhaps including Robinson's stolen $10,000, to purchase a self-storage yard in Santa Clara. This was not merely a job. This was infrastructure. A storage yard gave Curry something enormously valuable to a predator of his specific type. A private, enclosed space that he controlled entirely, with units that locked and unlocked at his discretion, where items and, it would turn out, bodies could be hidden in plain sight. The storage yard was Curry's empire, his domain, a maze of metal doors and padlocks that only he truly understood, because he held every key. It was through the operation of this storage business that Curry encountered his next confirmed victim. A 38-year-old man from Bakersfield named Richard Lemon Jr. Lemon was not a troublesome tenant, not a rival, not someone who had wronged Curry in any documented way. He simply came to the storage yard seeking a practical solution. He had 2 motorcycles, a truck, and various other belongings that needed a place to stay. He chose Curry's facility. He paid his rental fee. He was, by all accounts, friendly with Curry in the way that customers become friendly with service providers, the easy, low-stakes familiarity of shared purpose. And for a period, perhaps months, perhaps longer, that was the entirety of their relationship. A customer and a manager. A man with belongings and a man with lockers to store them in. Nothing alarming. Nothing that would cause a reasonable person to feel the cold shadow of danger. But at some point in late 1981 or early 1982, something shifted inside James Richard Curry's calculation. Perhaps Lemon had something Curry wanted. Perhaps he had witnessed something he should not have. Perhaps Curry's hunger for domination simply extended once more toward the nearest available target. Whatever the reason, by February of 1982, Curry had made a decision about Richard Lemon Jr., and decisions of that kind, made by men of Curry's nature, had only one conclusion. On February 17, 1982, Richard Lemon Jr. entered the Santa Clara storage yard for what he had no reason to believe was anything other than an ordinary visit. He may have been retrieving something from his unit, checking on his motorcycles, handling routine business. He walked into that space a living man with a future, with people who would eventually wonder where he had gone. And James Richard Curry ended that future with a single gunshot to the head. The body was not removed. It was not buried in a remote location, not weighted and dropped into water, not burned in the California hills. Instead, Curry placed it inside a wooden crate, the kind used for shipping, large enough to contain a man's remains, and sealed it. Then he left it there in his own storage unit, among the lockers and the padlocks and the ordinary suburban commerce of a storage facility on De La Cruz Boulevard. For months, the body of Richard Lemon Jr. decomposed inside that wooden box, while above and around it, people rented units and paid fees and loaded and unloaded their furniture and their seasonal decorations and their childhood boxes without any awareness that death was stored among them. It was audacious to the point of madness. But it also reflected something important about how Curry's mind worked. He did not panic after a killing. He did not flee. He continued operating his business, managing his property, functioning in the world with the practiced normalcy of a man who had decided long ago that other people's lives were his to take or spare as circumstances required. One of Lemon's motorcycles, authorities would later discover, had been given away by Curry to one of his own sons. He had stripped a murdered man's possessions and distributed them like gifts. This was the world James Richard Curry had constructed for himself by the middle of 1982. A dead coworker whose body had never been found. A murdered customer sealed in a crate in his own storage yard. A criminal record from Texas that no one in California had thought to check too carefully. And a self-contained empire of padlocks and property where his crimes could fester undiscovered. He was not finished. Not even close. The summer of 1982 was waiting, and along a Nevada highway near the shimmering waters of Lake Tahoe, a woman named Mary Edith Silvani was about to encounter James Richard Curry in the worst possible circumstances, and the ripples of that encounter would not fully reach the shore of justice for 37 years. July in the Sierra Nevada is one of the most beautiful times of year in that part of the American West. The mountain passes that had been snow-locked through winter and spring open fully in midsummer, and the air carries that particular high-altitude clarity that makes distant granite peaks look close enough to touch. Around Lake Tahoe, that vast, crystalline expanse straddling the California-Nevada border, one of the deepest lakes in North America. The summer of 1982 brought tourists, hikers, campers, and all the ordinary joy of people who had traveled to one of the most stunning natural environments on the continent. Mary Edith Silvani was 33 years old in the summer of 1982. She had, at some point in the years before her death, made her way to the western United States. The details of her life in the years preceding July 1982 are not fully documented, as would become devastatingly clear in the decades following her murder. What is known is that on July 17, 1982, she was somewhere in Washoe County, Nevada, in the high desert and mountain terrain east of Lake Tahoe's North Shore, when she crossed paths with James Richard Curry. The exact circumstances of that encounter have never been fully established. Under what pretext did Curry approach her? Did he offer a ride? Did he present himself as helpful, as ordinary, as safe? The mechanics of how a predator initiates contact with a victim are rarely left in the documentary record, particularly in cases where no witness survives. What investigators would piece together over the following decades, and ultimately confirm through forensic evidence, is that on that July afternoon, James Richard Curry sexually assaulted Mary Edith Silvani and then executed her. He shot her once in the back of the head. A single bullet. Deliberate. Cold. The same method he would employ again and again. The execution from behind, denying the victim even the final horror of watching death approach. He left her body along the Sheep's Flat hiking trail, a popular recreational area off the Mount Rose Highway above Incline Village on Nevada's side of the lake. The trail was well-traveled in summer. He had to have known that. Perhaps that was not a concern to him. Perhaps the brazenness had become its own kind of comfort. He removed every identifying item from her person. No purse, no wallet, no jewelry, no identification of any kind. She lay on that trail in a powder blue t-shirt, blue jeans, and yellow tennis shoes, with a bathing suit under her clothing. A detail that painted her as a woman enjoying a summer near the water. A woman whose day had included ordinary summer pleasures before it ended in violence on a mountainside. She was found by hikers that same day, July 17, 1982, and then began what would become one of the most prolonged identity mysteries in Nevada law enforcement history. The investigators who arrived at the Sheep's Flat Trail that summer afternoon faced an immediate and seemingly insurmountable problem. They had a victim and no name. They processed the scene. They gathered evidence. They recovered DNA material, including biological evidence from the sexual assault, material that would sit in evidence for decades, waiting for science to catch up to the crime. But in 1982, the technology that could turn that biological material into an identification barely existed in concept, let alone in practice. They had a woman in a blue t-shirt, and they had nothing else. She was given a designation rather than a name, Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, also referenced sometimes as Washoe County Jane Doe. The language of those designations reflects the particular tragedy of an unidentified victim. Reduced to a location and a legal category, her entire humanity compressed into a bureaucratic label. For 37 years, that was all she would officially be. A Jane Doe, a cold case, a mystery that Washoe County investigators kept alive through the seasons and the decades and the retirements of the detectives who had originally worked the scene. Meanwhile, the man who had killed her drove back down from the mountains, crossed back into California, and continued managing his storage yard on De La Cruz Boulevard, continued waking up in the morning, continued speaking to his children, continued functioning in the ordinary world with the corpse of Richard Lemon sealed in a wooden crate 40 feet from his office. The indifference to human life that characterized Curry's crimes was not merely a feature of the killings themselves. It was a constant, sustained orientation toward the world that allowed him to maintain this double existence across years. Detectives in Washoe County distributed flyers and photographs of the unidentified woman. They ran her description through national databases. They pursued every lead that emerged, however thin, however speculative. Nothing resolved. The case aged. The investigators who had knelt in the dirt of Sheep's Flat in 1982 moved on to other cases, retired, and eventually passed the file to others who had not been there, who worked the case from cold documentation rather than living memory. The Sheep's Flat Jane Doe became the kind of case that haunts a department, not because of its proximity in time, but because of its fundamental indignity. Somewhere out there, a family was missing a daughter, a sister, a person they had loved. And that person had been lying in an official file for years without a name. Back in California's Central Valley and the Bay Area, Curry continued building the web of personal grievances and transactional relationships that would ultimately produce the next phase of his violence. Through the same self-storage business that had already consumed Richard Lemon, he became acquainted with a couple, Gerald Novoselic, 39 years old, and his wife Sharon, 34. The Novoselices were not strangers in any meaningful sense. They ran their own storage facility, which put them in the same professional sphere as Curry, and for a period they were on sufficiently cordial terms that social interaction was possible between them. The families crossed paths at a Christmas party in 1981. It was at that Christmas gathering, in the context of holiday conversation, food, drink, and the forced intimacy of social obligation, that something cracked between Curry and Gerald Novoselic. The account Curry would later give was that Gerald had been drinking heavily and had been rude, crude, and offensive throughout the evening. Whether Gerald truly behaved badly or whether Curry's recollection was filtered through the self-serving narrative of a man constructing justifications for murder is impossible to know with certainty. What we know with certainty is that Curry left that Christmas party with a decision forming in the darker chambers of his mind. A decision about Gerald Novoselic and, by terrible extension, Gerald's wife. The killing of Richard Lemon in February of 1982 had apparently not satisfied whatever compulsion or need drove Curry to murder. The attack on Mary Silvani in July of 1982 had not resolved it either. Now, as 1982 turned toward 1983, Curry's focus settled onto the Novoselices with the particular intensity of someone who had already killed multiple times and no longer experienced the hesitation that might slow ordinary human beings who contemplate violence. Gerald Novoselic, for his part, had no warning of what was coming. In fact, The circumstances of his death underscore one of the most disorienting aspects of Curry's methodology. His victims did not sense danger because they were not meeting a stranger. They were meeting someone they knew, someone they had laughed with, spoken to, done business with. Gerald had apparently expressed interest in purchasing a .45 caliber revolver from Curry, and arrangements had been made, in what would become one of the most grotesquely ironic details in this entire case, for Curry to bring the weapon to the Novoselets' apartment on January 2, 1983, so that Gerald could look it over. Gerald Novoselets opened his front door on New Year's Day +1, in 1983, expecting a transaction. He expected to examine a weapon, discuss a price, perhaps hand over money for something that would protect him and his wife, that would sit in a drawer or a safe and serve as a last line of home defense. He let James Richard Curry into his home. He sat across from him in the apartment they shared, the apartment where Sharon was also present, the apartment that was supposed to be the safest place in their world. Curry handed over the gun for Gerald to examine, and in the moment that Gerald held it, possibly turning it over in his hands, asking questions about the caliber or the condition, Curry produced his own weapon and shot Gerald Novoselets once in the head. The shot was fatal and immediate. Gerald Novoselets fell in his own living room, killed by the man he had invited inside to conduct an ordinary transaction. Sharon Novoselets, 34 years old, was in that apartment when her husband was murdered. What followed was a sequence of events that reflected the absolute, calculated depravity at Curry's core. He did not flee. He did not panic. He went through the apartment and took what he wanted, reportedly around $400 in cash. Then he turned his attention to Sharon. She was taken from that apartment against her will, forced into Curry's vehicle while her husband lay dead on the floor behind her, driven away from the home she had shared with Gerald, from the life they had built together, from every possibility of rescue. The horror of those minutes in that vehicle, the knowledge that her husband was dead, that she was in the hands of the man who had killed him, that no one was coming, is not something that can be fully described. It belongs to a category of human suffering that language inadequately serves. At some point during the drive, Sharon Novoselets attempted to escape. The details are not thoroughly elaborated in the public record, but she made the attempt, a desperate, brave act of self-preservation in circumstances where self-preservation had all but been stripped away. Curry recaptured her. The attempt failed. Curry drove toward the San Francisco Bay Area, heading toward the Crystal Springs Reservoir, a large body of water in San Mateo County situated off Highway 92, in a stretch of road bordered by hills and eucalyptus trees, a place that in daylight served as a scenic corridor and in darkness served Curry's purpose with terrifying efficiency. He pulled over. He sexually assaulted Sharon Novoselets. And then, with the same cold precision he had employed on a Nevada hiking trail 6 months earlier, on a locksmith in a storage locker before that, and very likely on a missing man in Joaquina before that, he shot Sharon Novoselets in the head and left her body along the roadside near the reservoir. She was found on the side of Highway 92 later that same day, January 2nd, 1983. And in San Jose, investigators were already at the Novoselets' apartment, standing over Gerald's body, beginning to pull at the threads of what had happened. The threads led quickly, too quickly for Curry to escape. 2 days after the double murder, on January 4th, 1983, San Jose police detained James Richard Curry. He was 36 years old. He had been killing people, in all likelihood, for 5 years. And now, confronted with investigators who had already connected enough dots to make his position untenable, he made a decision that surprised everyone in that interrogation room. He started talking. There is a particular quality to the confessions of serial killers that distinguishes them from other criminal admissions. Ordinary criminals confess from weakness, because the evidence has overwhelmed them, because the walls have closed in, because the mathematics of the situation leave no other viable option. But certain killers confess with something different in their voice and their posture. Something that, if you have spent time in interrogation rooms and built a career studying the architecture of violent crime, you recognize immediately. They confess as though they are finally, after years of silence, able to speak freely. As though the secret has been a weight they are relieved to set down. As though telling the story is its own kind of satisfaction. Whether James Richard Curry's confession carried that quality is not something the historical record describes in precise emotional terms. But what is clear is that when investigators began pressing him about the deaths of Gerald and Sharon Novoselic in January 1983, Curry did not lawyer up and go silent. He did not offer a calculated partial admission. He confessed, and then he kept going. 3 murders, 3 full admissions. Gerald Novoselic, shot in the head in his own apartment. Sharon Novoselic, sexually assaulted and executed beside a California highway. And Richard Lemon Jr., shot in the head inside a Santa Clara storage locker nearly a year earlier. He told detectives where to find Lemon's body. The Santa Clara self-storage facility on De La Cruz Boulevard was not far from where investigators were already standing. A search warrant was obtained and the facility was entered. A maze of orange or gray metal doors lining long corridors, the kind of place that smells of dust and dry concrete and the faint chemical note of stored belongings. Unit by unit, law enforcement moved through the space until they reached the one Curry had directed them toward. Inside, among the accumulated evidence of a life lived as both businessman and predator, they found the wooden crate. When that crate was opened, they found Richard Lemon Jr., or what remained of him after nearly 11 months of decomposition in an enclosed, climate-uncontrolled space. The discovery was not merely horrifying in the visceral, physical sense, though it was certainly that. It was also a revelation about the depths of Curry's psychological detachment. He had continued running this business with a decomposing body sealed inside one of his own units. He had walked past that unit or near it. Every day he came to work. He had possibly rented adjacent units to paying customers. He had conducted the ordinary commerce of storage management, accepted fees, issued receipts, managed a legitimate business, while Richard Lemon Jr. lay sealed in a wooden box 30 feet away. The gun that had killed Lemon, and that had almost certainly been used in the other murders, was recovered as well. Ballistic and physical evidence began assembling around Curry like the closing walls of a cell, each piece confirming what his own words had already established. Investigators also examined the material connected to the suspected 5th victim, James DeWitt Robinson, the locksmith colleague who had vanished from Waukena in 1978. The .38 caliber handgun registered in Robinson's name. The checkbooks, the identification documents, and legal papers. All of it preserved in a storage unit that Curry controlled, all of it pointing unmistakably in one direction. But without a body, without physical remains, without the forensic confirmation that the law requires to formally close a murder case, the death of James DeWitt Robinson could not be officially charged. It remained, and remains to this day, the darkest of the confirmed suspicions surrounding Curry's crimes. A murder that almost certainly occurred, whose victim's family received no formal justice, and whose evidence exists in the form of personal effects stored like a trophy by the man who very likely killed him. The scale of what Curry had done across California and Nevada, across nearly 5 years of unchecked predation, was becoming clear to investigators with the speed and force of something long compressed suddenly releasing. A locksmith, a storage yard manager, a man who had passed in plain sight through multiple communities, who had employed the tools of his legitimate trade, physical access, trusted proximity, a working knowledge of how spaces are secured and entered, to eliminate people who threatened him, people who had property he wanted, and people who simply had the misfortune of being alone and vulnerable in his presence. The robbery and assault for which Curry had originally gone to prison in Texas were not aberrations. They were the prologue. The 20 years in Huntsville had not reformed him. They had refined him. They had given him time to understand how investigations worked, how evidence connected killers to victims, what mistakes amateur criminals made, and how to avoid them. The storage yard was not a random choice of profession, it was a controlled environment. The locksmithing was not a random career, it was a key. Every element of the life Curry constructed after his release from prison served, in one way or another, the continuation of what he had been doing before he went in. In the interrogation room, Curry's composure was, by accounts, remarkable. He confessed without theatrical breakdown. He reportedly asked one of the investigators, in what might be the single most unsettling detail to emerge from the entire arrest, to shoot him. Not as a legal request, not as a formal statement, but as a plain, declarative ask, "Shoot me." Whether this represented genuine suicidal ideation, a dark performance, or simply the request of a man who had already decided what came next is unclear. What it revealed was the fundamental orientation of someone who, having been caught, was already calculating his final move. Because James Richard Curry had decided, in that cell in the Santa Clara County Jail, that he would not be tried. He would not sit in a courtroom and be examined and evaluated and sentenced. He would not be the subject of psychiatric testimony or victim impact statements or a jury's deliberation. He had spent 20 years in a Texas prison, and he had experienced, firsthand, what it meant to lose control of your own circumstances, to be owned by an institution, to exist at the mercy of other people's decisions. He would not do it again. On January 5, 1983, 2 days after his arrest, 1 day after his confessions, with investigators still processing the evidence and preparing for what they expected would be a lengthy legal proceeding, James Richard Curry tore something from his cell or fashioned a cord from whatever was available, made a noose and hanged himself. He was found and cut down, but the damage was done. By the time medical personnel had him on life support at San Jose Hospital, Curry's brain had been deprived of oxygen for long enough that the neurological damage was irreversible. His vital signs declined steadily over the following 2 days as doctors assessed the situation and reached the conclusion that no meaningful recovery was possible. On January 7, 1983, physicians disconnected the life support equipment, and James Richard Curry was pronounced dead at 7:30 in the evening. Cause of death: suicide by hanging. He was 36 years old. He had been free for 6 years since his Texas release. He had killed, by the most conservative confirmed count, for human beings, and was suspected of a fifth whose remains were never located. He had sexually assaulted multiple women. He had hidden bodies in wooden crates and left them to decompose in storage units while he conducted business above them. And he had denied any courtroom the opportunity to fully confront him with the weight of what he had done. The case, as far as the 1983 crimes were concerned, was officially closed. Curry was dead. The 3 confessed murders had corroborating physical evidence. Richard Lemon's body had been recovered. Gerald Novoselic had been found in his apartment. Sharon Novoselic had been found beside the highway. The gun, the storage units, the confessions. The case against James Richard Curry was, in evidentiary terms, overwhelming. The fact that he died before trial was an injustice to the victims and their families, but it was not an evidentiary mystery. What remained was the woman on the mountain. Sheep's Flat Jane Doe continued to sit in the Washoe County cold case files through the late 1980s, through the 1990s, through the early years of the new millennium. The evidence collected at the scene in 1982, including critical biological material recovered from a rape kit, was maintained and preserved through those decades with the kind of institutional commitment to justice that deserves recognition. Many agencies allow cold case evidence to degrade, to be lost in moves and reorganizations, to succumb to the entropy of bureaucracy. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office kept the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe case alive, however faintly, through the long years when no solution appeared remotely possible. The 1990s brought the first generation of DNA profiling to law enforcement, and the FBI's combined DNA index system, CODIS, created a national database against which biological evidence could be compared. The Sheep's Flat case had DNA material. Investigators submitted it to CODIS. No match was returned. The database, comprehensive as it was becoming, did not contain a profile for James Richard Curry. Because James Richard Curry had died in 1983, before DNA profiling existed in any meaningful form, before databases were built and policies were established to collect biological material from criminal defendants. He had slipped through, not through cunning but through timing, through the accident of having committed his crimes in a period just before the science that would have identified him was developed. And so the woman in the powder blue t-shirt and yellow tennis shoes remained nameless into the 21st century. Technology advanced. Genomic databases grew. The world of forensic genealogy, the application of consumer-grade ancestry DNA platforms and genealogical research techniques to criminal investigations, was beginning to emerge from the frontier of investigative practice and move toward something that law enforcement could actually use. And in the mid-2010s, 2,000 miles away in Nevada, a forensic investigator attended a lecture that would set in motion the final unraveling of James Richard Curry's last secret. In February of 2018, a criminalist from the Washoe County Sheriff's Forensic Science Division sat in a lecture hall and listened to Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a geneticist with a reputation that had been building for years in the niche but rapidly expanding world of forensic genealogy. Present on the emerging methodology of using publicly accessible consumer DNA databases to identify both victims and perpetrators in cold cases that traditional forensic tools had been unable to resolve. Fitzpatrick's work was part of a broader revolution taking place at the intersection of genetics, genealogy, and criminal justice. The same platforms that millions of ordinary citizens were using to discover their ancestry and find long-lost relatives, platforms built on the voluntary submission of DNA samples and the construction of vast, searchable genetic family trees, could, with the right combination of scientific rigor and investigative technique, be turned into instruments of identification for the dead and the unknown. The basic principle was elegant in its simplicity and staggering in its implications. If you upload an unknown person's DNA to a platform where enough living relatives have their own profiles, the overlaps in genetic material create connections that can be walked backward through genealogical research until an identity emerges. For the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe, who had lain nameless for 36 years by the time that 2018 lecture took place, this methodology represented the first genuine possibility of resolution that investigators had encountered since the case was opened. The Washoe County Sheriff's Office reached out to Fitzpatrick and to the DNA Doe Project, a nonprofit dedicated to identifying unknown deceased persons through forensic genealogy, and the work began. The victim's DNA, extracted from evidence preserved since 1982, was sent to a private laboratory for processing and then uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database that, at the time, allowed law enforcement use of its platform for investigative purposes. Fitzpatrick and her team of genealogists began the painstaking work of sorting through the database results, the partial matches, the distant cousins, the fragments of genetic connection that pointed toward an extended family tree. The research that followed required the kind of sustained intellectual labor that is rarely visible to the public who ultimately receives the results. The walking of family trees backward and forward across generations, the cross-referencing of census records and birth certificates and historical documents, the patient elimination of individuals who did not fit the profile until the narrowing finally resolved into a specific name. The team established that the victim was connected genealogically to a family with roots in the Pontiac and Detroit, Michigan area. They traced the branches. They narrowed the possibilities. They identified her as almost certainly belonging to the Silvani family, the only daughter of John and Blanche Silvani of Michigan. Final confirmation came from an unexpected source. The Detroit Police Department's Records Division, which maintained fingerprint files from a 1974 misdemeanor arrest for loitering. The prints on file matched those taken from the unidentified woman found at Sheep's Flat in 1982. The woman in the powder blue t-shirt had been Mary Edith Silvani. She had been 33 years old when she died. She had been born in Pontiac, Michigan. She had been the only daughter of a family that had spent decades not knowing what had become of her. A family fragmented by time and circumstance, whose living members would describe, when they eventually learned the truth in 2019, the devastating complexity of being given an answer so long after the question was first posed. But identification of the victim was only half of the work. The killer's DNA had also been recovered from the scene in 1982. The same biological material that confirmed the assault confirmed the perpetrator's genetic profile. And that profile also needed a name. The genealogical research into the perpetrator's DNA followed a similarly intricate path. The genetic material found at the scene pointed toward a family whose roots lay in Dallas, Texas. Fitzpatrick and her team traced the tree outward from that geographic and genetic center, working through the branches, eliminating possibilities. They established that the suspect was the grandson of a Dallas couple, a couple who had raised 3 sons. But the living grandchildren of that couple did not match the profile in the database, which meant the suspect was not among the known descendants. The answer lay in a secret. One of those 3 sons had fathered an illegitimate child. A child born of an affair, raised by the mother under a different family name, not officially counted among the Dallas family's documented descendants. an illegitimate child born in Behar, Texas on November 16, 1946, who had been raised under a borrowed surname and had moved to California in 1977 after serving 20 years in a Texas prison. James Richard Curry. To confirm it with the certitude the law requires, investigators reached out to Curry's biological children. Two people who were very much alive in 2019, who had their own DNA profiles that bore the genetic markers of their father's lineage. They cooperated voluntarily. Their profiles were compared to the material recovered from the Sheep's Flat scene in 1982. The match was unambiguous. The father of these two living people was the man who had sexually assaulted and executed Mary Edith Silvani beside a Lake Tahoe hiking trail on July 17, 1982. The science was definitive. The case was closed. On May 7, 2019, 37 years, 2 months, and 20 days after Mary Silvani's body was found on that Nevada mountainside, Washoe County Sheriff Darren Balam stood before cameras and reporters and announced two names: Mary Edith Silvani, James Richard Curry, a victim and her killer, both named on the same day, both identified through science that could not have existed when the crime was committed, both given back to the historical record after nearly 4 decades of anonymity. The sheriff's statement captured something that transcends the usual language of case closings. He noted that approximately 2,000 hours of labor had been invested in identifying both individuals. 2,000 hours, spread across years and careers and shifts worked by investigators who were not yet born when the crime occurred, who inherited the case as a cold file and treated it as a personal obligation. The persistence behind those 2,000 hours. The refusal to let a nameless woman remain nameless, to allow a killer's last secret to hold indefinitely, represents something worth pausing to acknowledge in the midst of a story that is otherwise relentlessly dark. For Mary Silvani's family, the announcement brought a grief both renewed and finally defined. Her cousin Angel Capriles, speaking to reporters in 2019, described the revelation as something that turned her life upside down. Not because it delivered peace in any simple sense, but because it reframed decades of family silence and absence. Silvani had been forgotten, even by the people closest to her, in the way that families sometimes close over a missing person when years pass without resolution, when absence hardens into a kind of suspended grief that is never formally named. Now it had a name. Now it had a date and a place and a perpetrator. The completeness was, as Capriles conveyed, more complicated than relief. For the investigators who had worked the case, particularly those who had first processed the scene in 1982 and had lived with the mystery for the intervening decades, the resolution offered the particular closure that only comes from completing something long left unfinished. The case that had defined an era of the department's cold case work, that had been passed from detective to detective like a torch whose flame refused to go out, had finally illuminated its answer. James Richard Curry, however, would not sit in any courtroom for the murder of Mary Silvani any more than he had sat in one for the murders of the Novoselatzes or Richard Lemon. He had made certain of that in January of 1983, with a makeshift noose and 2 days on life support. The legal system's most fundamental instrument of reckoning, the trial, the confrontation, the formal pronouncement of guilt before law and society, was denied to every one of his victims' families by the single act of self-destruction Curry carried out in that Santa Clara cell. But denial of trial is not denial of truth. The confessions exist. The forensic evidence exists. The DNA confirmation exists. The identity of the Sheep's Flat Jane Doe exists, because investigators refused to let it remain hidden. Whatever power Curry believed he exercised by dying before his day in court was, in the end, not the power he imagined. The names he left unnamed were named anyway. The woman he stripped of identification on a Nevada mountainside was given back her name 3.5 decades later. The children he had fathered, whose DNA he passed on without any awareness that it would one day betray him across the distance of death, were the instruments of his final exposure. The case of James Richard Curry is not, ultimately, a story about the success of evil. Evil operated here, undeniably in detail in blood. 5 people almost certainly dead. For confirmed, a woman left nameless for nearly 40 years, families fractured and frozen in unanswered grief. The particular horror of a predator who weaponized trust, who turned the tools of an ordinary profession into instruments of murder and concealment. The specific depravity of a man who stored a body in a crate and managed the business above it without flinching. But at the end of the telling, the case is also a story about something that outlasted James Richard Curry's ability to destroy it. The persistence of identity. Mary Silvani's identity, which survived 37 years of official namelessness and was given back to her through science and dedication. The persistence of investigative commitment. 2,000 hours of labor that spanned generations of law enforcement personnel, all in service of giving one unknown woman her name back. The persistence of the biological record. The DNA that Curry carried in every cell of his body, that he passed to his children, that ultimately pulled his name out of the genealogical dark and attached it to the crime he thought he had buried with his victim's identification. Justice, when it arrived late and imperfectly, as it often does with cases like this one. It arrived without a courtroom, without a verdict read aloud, without the procedural theater that gives victims' families the formal acknowledgement they deserve. It arrived as a press release, a DNA match, a name announced from behind a podium in Reno, Nevada, in May of 2019. It was not the justice that the law ideally delivers, but it was truth. And in the absence of everything else, truth, named loudly, recorded permanently, attached to the right people on the right side of the crime, is not nothing. Mary Edith Silvani, Richard Lemon Jr., Gerald Novoselic, Sharon Novoselic, James DeWitt Robinson. These are the names that matter in this story. They were real people with real lives, real families, real futures that were violently interrupted by a man who decided their lives were his to take. They deserve to be named with full weight and deliberate intention, because the predator who targeted them spent years trying to ensure they would be remembered by no one. The science made sure they were not forgotten, and the man who tried to lock them away behind doors that only he held the keys to. The storage yard slayer, James Richard Curry, found, in the end, that there is no lock strong enough to keep the truth from eventually finding its way out. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Blade in the Dark. The Koreatown slasher, Joseph Martin Danks, aka the Ghost of Vermont Avenue. Some men collapse under the weight of a broken life. Others fold it into a weapon and go hunting in the dark. January 1987. The streets of Los Angeles' Koreatown neighborhood. A cold-blooded predator moved through those alleys like smoke, silent, purposeful, and terrifyingly invisible. He did not stalk the wealthy. He did not target the powerful. He chose the forgotten. The men who slept on sidewalks, beneath overpasses, and in the doorways of shuttered buildings. Men whose disappearance, he calculated, would barely register a whisper. And for a while he was right. While the city slept, while the neon glow of the boulevard cast long shadows across cracked concrete, Joseph Martin Danks pressed a kitchen knife into human flesh again and again and again, and then vanished back into the night as if the darkness itself had swallowed him whole. By the time Los Angeles understood what was happening in its streets, 6 men were dead. 2 more had barely escaped with their lives. And somewhere among those alleyways, a 7th victim, a man named Edwin Trujillo, may have died on Christmas Day without anyone even knowing a monster was responsible. This is the story of a man whose mind had been fracturing for decades, whose rage finally found a target in the most vulnerable human beings on Earth, and whose capacity for violence did not end when the handcuffs closed around his wrists. This is the story of the Koreatown slasher, the man the streets came to fear before they even knew his name. There is a particular kind of damage that begins before a person is even born. It seeps into the blood, saturates the earliest memories, and constructs a foundation so unstable that every floor built upon it tilts and cracks and eventually gives way beneath the weight of a human life. For Joseph Martin Danks, that damage began on the morning of June 17, 1962, in Bay City, Michigan, and it never stopped. His origin was complicated from the very first breath. Joseph's biological father was Edward White, a 42-year-old man from a family of considerable wealth. Edward's own father had been a successful entrepreneur, and the family name carried with it a certain gravity, a certain expectation of propriety. But Edward had long since squandered whatever promise his bloodline suggested. By the time Joseph was conceived, Edward White was a man devoured by addiction. Alcohol and drugs had long since stripped him of his health, his finances, and whatever moral architecture might have once held him upright. His older children from a previous relationship lived in conditions bordering on poverty despite their father's wealthy lineage. One of Joseph's half-brothers, a man named Earl, suffered from schizophrenia, a detail that would take on a chilling resonance in the years that followed. Joseph's mother, Karen, was 17 years old when she entered into a relationship with Edward. She was his nanny, a teenager in the employment of a wealthy, dissolute man twice her age. The circumstances of their relationship raise their own uncomfortable questions, but what is documented is that Karen, still a teenager herself, drank alcohol throughout her pregnancy. The consequences of that choice would be immediate and lasting. Joseph arrived 2 months premature, weighing barely 2 kilograms. The infant who entered the world fighting for breath spent 4 weeks in an incubator, his tiny body laboring through those first weeks of life with no margin for error. What came after was no better. Even once Joseph was home, neither of his biological parents managed to offer him the consistent, sober care that a premature infant demanded. According to the family housekeeper, a woman who would later testify about what she witnessed in those early years, Karen was frequently overwhelmed and avoidant. On at least 2 separate occasions, the housekeeper arrived to find the infant Joseph locked inside a dresser drawer, crying, while his mother sought distance from the noise and responsibility. The couple allegedly administered sedatives to the baby to keep him quiet, though Karen would later deny this claim. What cannot be denied is that the child was found, more than once, alone and in distress, wet, hungry, and screaming in a home where the adults were either too consumed by their own chaos or too indifferent to respond. In early 1964, Edward White escalated his violence against Karen, striking her hard enough to break her nose. That act of brutality at least accomplished one thing. It drove Karen out of the home and away from Edward. She left with Joseph, and the chapter of his life lived under his biological father's roof came to a close before he was old enough to form a conscious memory of it. But the damage embedded in those first formative months had already taken root. Karen moved forward with the grim pragmatism of a young woman with limited options. By 1965, she had met a man named Leroy Danks. They married in 1966, and Leroy formally adopted the boy, giving him the surname that would one day appear in headlines across California. The family relocated first to South Dakota, then to Wyoming, and 2 more sons were born into the household. For a brief period, there must have been something resembling stability. But the pattern that had defined Joseph's earliest years reasserted itself. Leroy Danks grew unhappy. Arguments multiplied. In December 1970, when Joseph was 8 years old, Leroy walked away from the family entirely. Karen remarried again, this time to a man named Gene Walls, and the household shifted once more. The years that followed were marked by transience and instability. Joseph's home life was a revolving door of figures who came and left, of addresses that changed before any sense of rootedness could develop. In 1976, Karen returned with Joseph and Gene Walls to Bay City, Michigan, and it was there that Joseph reconnected with his biological father and 2 half-brothers, Michael and Peter. What he found was not a reunion of warmth or healing. Edward White, once from a family of privilege, had by then lost everything. He and Joseph's half-brothers lived in a trailer. The The household was sustained by petty thefts and fueled by a rotating menu of narcotics, marijuana, LSD, phencyclidine. The environment was chaotic, lawless, and deeply scarring for a teenager already navigating serious instability. In 1977, when Joseph was 15, he suffered 2 separate traffic accidents within the span of several months. One of those accidents resulted in a head injury, a detail that would later become significant when psychiatrists attempted to understand the neurological underpinnings of his deteriorating mental state. Physically, Joseph recovered. But something had shifted in the architecture of his mind, and the changes that began to manifest after his recovery were alarming. He started believing that he was being watched through the television. He moved furniture around the house in compulsive, inexplicable patterns. He deliberately short-circuited the electrical wiring in his home, convinced that something sinister was being transmitted through the walls. He accused his mother, his relatives, everyone around him of trying to poison him. He refused to eat food prepared in the house unless he had personally washed the dishes multiple times beforehand. He claimed to receive communications from his deceased grandparents. He believed, with the unshakable certainty of a mind coming apart at its seams, that President Ronald Reagan smoked 10,000 marijuana blunts a day, and that this made his own drug use entirely unremarkable. He was deteriorating, visibly, measurably, frighteningly, and yet no one intervened with any sustained effectiveness. In 1978, Joseph was arrested in Mexico on charges of drug possession, escaping with only a minor administrative fine, a leniency that did nothing to interrupt the downward trajectory. That same year, upon learning of the arrest, his biological father Edward told him that he was not his son, that he did not want him near his trailer, and that he should never make contact again. The rejection from the only man he had sought to reconnect with, delivered with cold finality, was another fracture in a psyche already splintered in too many places to count. Joseph dropped out of school. He left home and began drifting, hitchhiking between cities and states, accumulating days and weeks of rootless wandering that deepened his dissociation from ordinary reality. By the early 1980s, he had become a figure of profound concern to anyone who encountered him. Disheveled, delusional, prone to confrontation, and utterly resistant to the notion that anything was wrong with him. In October 1982, Joseph appeared at an elementary school in New Jersey wearing torn, dirty clothes. The school contacted police. He was brought to a station and eventually returned to Michigan, where the cycle of erratic behavior, petty offenses, and brief institutional interventions continued. He was eventually confined to a mental health facility, but escaped after 2 weeks. He was found in Florida and returned. He received treatment until early 1984, was released, and went home to his mother. For a brief, fragile period, there was something approaching normalcy. His stepfather Leroy, who had returned to some peripheral role in Joseph's life, offered him a job, driving truck routes, hoping that work and structure might tether the young man to something real. For a time, it almost seemed to be working. But by 1985, Joseph's mental state began unraveling again. He refused to enter restaurants or public spaces with his stepfather. He demanded that food be brought to him in the truck cab. He became convinced that an unidentified malevolent entity was pursuing him. He was frightened, hostile, and increasingly impossible to reach. He left his stepfather and returned to the road. In 1986, he spent time with his half-brother Peter in Michigan. But Peter had undergone his own transformation during a prison sentence. He had converted to a religious faith, married, and genuinely stepped away from the criminal lifestyle. The contrast between Peter's hard-won stability and Joseph's spiraling unraveling created tension that made cohabitation impossible. Joseph left. In June 1986, he was arrested for illegally possessing a sawed-off shotgun. While incarcerated in the county jail awaiting resolution of the charge, he exhibited compulsive cleanliness behaviors, washing his belongings repeatedly, maintaining obsessive order in his cell, brushing his teeth between 6 and 10 times a day. He pleaded guilty to an amended charge of attempted theft and received 5 years of probation, another lenient consequence that released him back into the world without addressing the seething storm building within him. By the end of 1986, Joseph Martin Danks had arrived in Los Angeles, California. He had no job, no fixed address, and no remaining tether to the kind of ordinary social structure that might have provided an outlet for the rage and paranoia building inside him. He roamed the streets of Koreatown, sleeping where he could, watching the men who occupied the same margins of society that he himself was pressing against. And somewhere in the warped, fractured landscape of his deteriorating mind, he made a decision, or perhaps it did not feel like a decision at all. Perhaps, to him, it felt like an imperative, like a calling, like something that had always been inevitable, waiting patiently at the end of a very long, very broken road. January 1987 was 17 days old when the first body was discovered. The killing had already begun. January in Los Angeles carries a deceptive mildness. The temperatures are cool but rarely punishing, the nights clear and dry. For the homeless population of Koreatown, the men who claimed doorways and park benches and narrow alley spaces as their sleeping quarters, January nights were manageable. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but survivable. What none of them could have anticipated was that in January 1987, the greatest threat to their survival was not exposure or cold or hunger. It was a man with a kitchen knife and a mind filled with contempt. Joseph Danks would later tell investigators, with a directness that was almost clinical in its ugliness, that his motive for the killings was personal enmity toward those he considered dirty, filthy individuals unworthy of their place in the world. He looked at the men sleeping on those sidewalks, men who had their own histories, their own families somewhere, their own names and faces and stories, and he saw something beneath contempt. He saw targets. The first to die was Christopher Michael Fursblade. He was 40 years old. He was on Vermont Avenue in the neighborhood that Danks had made his hunting ground when the attack came. There was no warning, no escalation, no confrontation. Danks approached from behind, a method he would repeat with almost mechanical consistency throughout his rampage, and drove a kitchen knife into Fursblade's body with tremendous force. The wound was deep and decisive. Christopher Fursblade died on January 6, 1987, on a street in Koreatown, and the city did not yet understand what had been set into motion. 8 days passed. 8 days in which Danks moved through the neighborhood freely, invisibly, watched by no one of consequence. Whatever was occurring inside his mind during that interval, the paranoid calculations, the delusions, the voices he claimed to hear, it did not slow him down. It may, in fact, have been accelerating him toward something worse. On January 14th, Danks killed twice in a single day. His first victim that morning was 58-year-old Isaac Davis, attacked on South Menlo Avenue. Davis was stabbed with the same ferocious force that had characterized the assault on Fursblade. Driven from behind, the blade penetrating deeply, the life leaving the body before any meaningful resistance was possible. Less than 3 hours later, with the blood of one man still a recent memory, Danks found 55-year-old John Charles Coble on West 9th Street. He stabbed Coble multiple times. The multiplicity of the wounds tells its own terrible story. This was not a single decisive strike, but a sustained assault, the knife rising and falling, the attacker unwilling to stop until the victim was unquestionably, irreversibly gone. John Coble died on that street, and Los Angeles still did not fully comprehend the pattern forming in its midst. 2 days after the double murder, on January 16th, Danks struck again. The victim was a homeless man on West 8th Street whose identity has never been established. Estimated to have been approximately 43 years of age, this man exists in the historical record only as an unnamed presence. A life ended violently by someone who did not consider him worth knowing and whom circumstances conspired to leave without even the basic dignity of a name attached to the documentation of his death. He deserved better. He deserved a name on a record. He deserved to be remembered as more than a statistic in a killer's accumulating tally. The very next day, January 17th, Danks moved against 64-year-old Almond Lord on South Kenmore Avenue. But something different happened this time. Almond Lord, 64 years old, and by no objective measure a man equipped for physical confrontation with a knife-wielding attacker, resisted. He fought back. He refused to simply absorb the violence being visited upon him and collapse. His resistance startled Danks enough to make the killer retreat, abandoning the assault and disappearing back into the streets. Lord survived, wounded, shaken, and forever altered by the encounter, but alive. And crucially, he was coherent enough in the aftermath to provide law enforcement with a description of his attacker. That description would be used to construct a facial composite, a rough portrait of the face-haunting Koreatown streets. But the composite would not reach the public in time to prevent what came next. On January 20th, Joseph Danks found 58-year-old James Lyons at Manhattan Place. He attacked Lyons with the knife, driving the blade into the man's body, leaving him gravely wounded. But Lyons, like Lord before him, did not die. He was found, received medical attention, and survived. Another voice who could speak to what Danks had done. Another survivor who had looked into the face of the predator moving through their neighborhood and lived to describe it. But the same day brought another death. Within hours of the attack on Lyons, perhaps emboldened by having just committed violence and walked away unchallenged, Danks found another homeless man in his 50s on Southwestern Avenue. This man, like the victim on West 8th Street, was never identified. His life, his name, his history, all of it absorbed by the anonymity that had defined his existence in the margins of Los Angeles. Danks stabbed him to death on Southwestern Avenue as the city moved around them, indifferent and unaware. That final murder, however, did not go entirely unseen. A witness observed the attack or its immediate aftermath and gave chase. For 5 full city blocks, this witness pursued Danks through the streets of Koreatown, refusing to let the killer simply dissolve into the urban landscape. The witness eventually stopped running and called the police. Officers responded, and on the morning of January 20th, 1987, Joseph Martin Danks was cornered in a Koreatown alley. The scene of his arrest is almost perversely anticlimactic given the savagery of what he had done. This was a man who had driven a kitchen knife into human bodies at least 6 times, who had struck without warning, who had killed with a cold and deliberate efficiency that spoke to a mind organized around violence even as it unraveled in every other respect. And when the police cornered him in that alley, he surrendered without resistance. The only action he took in those final moments before the handcuffs came was to wrap the kitchen knife in a newspaper and attempt to dispose of it. A gesture that was almost pathetically inadequate given the circumstances, and which was rendered entirely meaningless when officers found the blade during a search of the area. At the police station, Danks waived his Miranda rights without hesitation. He did not demand an attorney. He did not hedge or deflect or construct an alibi. He sat down and confessed, fully in detail on tape, to all 6 killings. The recorded confession was comprehensive. It mapped the crimes with a precision that left investigators in little doubt that the man across the table from them was precisely who they had been searching for. And then he went further. During the interrogation at Parker Center, Danks told investigators about a 7th death, a man named Edwin Trujillo, whom he claimed to have stabbed to death in Santa Monica on Christmas Day, 1986. According to Danks, he had gone to a homeless shelter seeking a place to sleep but was turned away due to overcrowding. The refusal enraged him. He found Trujillo, a homeless man, and stabbed him in what he described as a fit of anger. Police investigated the claim but were never able to substantiate whether a killing matching that description had occurred. The question of Edwin Trujillo, whether he died on Christmas Day 1986 at Joseph Danks' hands, whether he was simply an invention of a fractured mind, or whether his death went unreported and unrecorded, has never been definitively answered. What was confirmed was the weapon that had claimed 6 verified lives. A kitchen knife. Its blade dimensions matched precisely in width, in length, in the configuration of its edge, the depths and characteristics of the wounds found on each victim. Physical evidence and confession together built a case that left no meaningful room for doubt. The Koreatown slasher had a name, a face, and a story that the city was only beginning to understand. Los Angeles Police Chief Daryl Gates held a press conference to announce the arrest. The case, which had generated fear and confusion throughout the neighborhood, had its resolution. A man named Christopher John Regal, 34 years old, had been held as the primary suspect in the Koreatown killings until Danks' arrest, and with the confession and the physical evidence locking Danks to the crimes, Regal was released from custody, his ordeal of suspicion finally over. The story of what Joseph Danks had done in those 14 days of January 1987 was now public. But the full accounting of who he was, and what he was still capable of, was far from complete. There is a particular cruelty in the assumption that placing a dangerous person inside a prison cell renders the people around him safe. Walls and bars constrain geography. They do not constrain the human capacity for violence. Joseph Martin Danks would prove this with devastating finality, not once but in accumulating demonstrations of what he was willing to do to another human being when circumstance presented the opportunity. The courtroom proceedings that followed his January 1987 arrest were complicated from the outset by the obvious reality of his mental state. The behaviors he had been exhibiting for years, the paranoid ideation, the auditory hallucinations, the compulsive rituals, the delusions involving famous figures and government conspiracies, did not moderate upon incarceration. If anything, the pressure of the legal system seemed to amplify them. While housed at Men's Central County Jail awaiting trial, Danks became increasingly erratic and unsettling even by the standards of the jail environment. He was convinced that his food was being poisoned, the same conviction that had shadowed him throughout his adult life, now rooted in the daily reality of prison meals. He complained that the administration was psychologically manipulating him through music broadcast through the cameras in his cell. He maintained obsessive cleanliness in his living space, brushing his teeth between 6 and 10 times every day, a compulsion that had followed him from the county jail he'd been held in after the sawed-off shotgun arrest. And his beliefs about his fellow inmates were extraordinary. He was certain with the unassailable confidence of a disordered mind, that actor Burt Reynolds and television host Johnny Carson were being held in his jail cell with him, and that these imaginary cellmates were contaminating his food. The delusion was detailed, persistent, and entirely disconnected from observable reality. His legal proceedings reflected the chaos of his mental state. In March 1988, the prosecutor's office offered Danks a plea agreement. He refused it. Months passed. The trial proceeded under conditions that his defense attorneys found deeply challenging to manage. And then, in one of the court hearings, Danks attacked his own lawyer, a man named Larry Rivets who had presumably worked hard and at some personal risk to represent his deeply unstable client. Danks had constructed a makeshift knife from a toothbrush and embedded razor blades, and he drove it into Rivets during a court hearing, inflicting a wound that was, fortunately, superficial. But the intent was unmistakable. The message was unmistakable. This was a man who would turn violence on anyone in his orbit when the internal calculus, whatever dark arithmetic governed his fractured mind, demanded it. By December 1988, Danks' attorney had persuaded him to accept a revised plea deal, in which the death penalty was taken off the table in exchange for a guilty plea on all 6 counts of murder. On December 23, 1988, Joseph Martin Danks was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole, after 156 years. It was a sentence designed to ensure that he would never walk free again, a mathematical impossibility dressed in legal language. But the story was not over, not even close. Due to the ongoing deterioration of his mental health, Danks was transferred to Atascadero State Hospital in June 1989. There, for the first time with any genuine rigor, he underwent comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. The diagnosis that emerged from those assessments was formal and unambiguous: paranoid schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. His IQ was tested and measured at 106, squarely within the average range, a fact that complicated any narrative that his violence was simply the product of intellectual limitation. This was a man of average intelligence, capable of understanding his environment, capable of planning, capable of recognizing consequences. The violence he perpetrated was not the product of an inability to think. It was the product of a mind that thought in ways profoundly disconnected from the moral and perceptual frameworks that anchor most human beings to civilized behavior. A neurological examination was conducted to investigate the possibility of a brain cyst, given the head injury he had sustained in the 1977 traffic accident. No cyst was found. No structural abnormality was identified. The fractures in Joseph Danks were not visible on a scan. They lived somewhere deeper, in the tangled chemistry and misfiring architecture of a mind that had been under assault since before it drew its first breath. Treatment at Atascadero produced some improvement. By August 1990, his condition was considered sufficiently stable to warrant a transfer out of the hospital and back into the general prison population. He was moved to the California Correctional Institution in Tehachapi, and it was at Tehachapi that the next chapter of Joseph Danks' violence was written. Approximately 1 month after his arrival, Danks was placed in a cell that already had an occupant. The man's name was Walter Holt. He was 67 years old. Whatever Walter Holt's own story was, whatever circumstances had brought him to a cell in Tehachapi, whatever life had preceded his incarceration, he was now sharing a small, enclosed space with a man who had already killed 6 people and who did not want a cellmate. Danks had previously had a cell to himself. The introduction of another person into that space triggered something catastrophic. On the night of September 1990, approximately 3 hours after being assigned to the cell and after Walter Holt had fallen asleep, Joseph Danks tore strips from his bedsheet and fashioned them into a ligature. He wrapped that makeshift rope around Walter Holt's neck while the 67-year-old man slept, and he strangled him to death. When prison guards discovered the body and confronted Danks, he offered a confession almost as readily as he had confessed to the Koreatown killings 3 years earlier. He told them precisely what he had done, precisely how he had done it, and precisely when. He stated that voices he attributed to divine origin, had commanded him to kill the man. He framed the killing as an act of obedience to a higher authority, an instruction he had no choice but to follow. Investigators and prosecutors were skeptical of this framing. The forensic evidence and the deliberate, methodical nature of the killing, the tearing of the sheet, the fashioning of the ligature, the selection of a moment when the victim was asleep and therefore maximally vulnerable, spoke to planning, to calculation, to the same cold operational thinking that had characterized the Koreatown killings. A jury agreed. Danks was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Walter Holt. At his 1993 trial, he was convicted. The jury sentenced him to death. But even during the period between the murder and the trial, Danks continued to demonstrate that he was incapable of existing in proximity to other people without creating danger. On November 12, 1991, a correctional officer conducting a cell search found a plastic shank, approximately 5 inches long, sharpened to a functional point, concealed inside the mattress of Danks' bunk. The weapon had been manufactured and hidden with apparent deliberateness, the work of a man who was always, on some level, preparing for his next act of violence. On January 23, 1992, during a routine strip search conducted by Correctional Officer Albert Carter, further contraband was discovered on Danks' person. The accumulation of these incidents painted a portrait of an incarcerated individual who had not accepted his circumstances, had not been neutralized by the environment meant to contain him, and who continued to arm himself and equip himself for violence even in the most controlled setting the California correctional system could provide. The 1993 trial for Walter Holt's murder generated its own procedural complications. 2 jurors sought guidance from clergy members of their parish during deliberations, a clear violation of the rules governing jury conduct, which prohibit any discussion of the case outside the formal deliberation process. Danks' lawyers would later cite this misconduct as grounds for an appeal, arguing that the interference of outside religious counsel had tainted the verdict. In 2004, the California Supreme Court heard the appeal in the case formerly designated People v. Danks. The court dismissed it. The death sentence stood. Following the verdict, Joseph Martin Danks was transferred to San Quentin State Prison's death row, where he has remained. The years on death row have not brought him peace or resolution. His mental health has continued to deteriorate in documented and disturbing ways. He has frequently complained of hallucinations involving rats gnawing at his body, rats that correctional searches consistently fail to find any evidence of. He has been plagued by insomnia severe enough to disturb the rest of other inmates, screaming through the night in ways that reverberate through the cell block. He has repeatedly attacked prison guards, going so far as to douse officers with his own urine in acts of degradation and aggression that speak to the depth of his hostility toward any figure of authority. Despite the visibility and severity of these symptoms, Danks went untreated for the entirety of his time on death row until 2011. More than a decade of documented psychotic behavior met with institutional indifference. The question of why a man so clearly and visibly suffering from severe psychiatric illness was allowed to deteriorate for that length of time without intervention is one that speaks to the broader failures of a correctional system ill-equipped to address the intersection of criminal justice and serious mental illness. Joseph Martin Danks has now occupied a cell on California's death row for decades. He is among the hundreds of men awaiting execution in a state that has not carried one out in many years, California's capital punishment apparatus suspended in a prolonged bureaucratic and moral stalemate that has left its death row population in a kind of legal limbo, condemned in law, preserved in practice. For the families of his victims, for the survivors of his attacks, for anyone who knew and mourned the men whose lives he ended, this limbo carries its own particular anguish. Justice was declared. Its ultimate enactment remains perpetually deferred. The legal proceedings that followed his death sentence have been extensive. In 2003, Danks' attorneys filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus with the California Supreme Court, initiating what would become a years-long process of appeals and reviews. The 2004 People v. Danks decision addressed the juror misconduct question. The two jurors who had sought religious counsel during deliberations on the Walter Holt murder and determined that while the conduct was improper, it did not rise to a level sufficient to overturn the verdict. The California Supreme Court affirmed the judgment. Danks' attorneys subsequently sought review from the United States Supreme Court. In November 2004, the nation's highest court declined to hear the case. The denial of certiorari left the death sentence intact. A second habeas petition was filed in September 2011. The California Supreme Court ultimately transferred it to Kern County Superior Court for adjudication. That court considered 7 separate claims, all of which centered on Danks' mental state, at the time of the Walter Holt murder, during his trial, and in his current condition on death row. On September 10, 2021, the trial court denied the petition, finding all 7 claims either successive to prior petitions or premature for review. Danks' request for a certificate of appealability to the 5th Appellate District was denied in 2021. A petition to the United States Supreme Court was filed in early 2022 and denied in October of that year. The legal road has run out of visible turns. The case has been reviewed at every level of the California judicial system and twice rejected by the United States Supreme Court. What remains is the ongoing reality of Joseph Danks on death row. Aging, mentally ill, and in the custody of a state that condemned him but has not yet executed him and shows no immediate indication of doing so. But step back from the procedural record and the court dockets and the cold language of judicial opinions, and consider instead the full weight of what this case represents, what it asks of us, what it reveals about the conditions that produced it, and what it demands that we reckon with honestly. 7 men lost their lives at Joseph Danks' hands, by the accounting of his own confession. 6 of them, Christopher Michael Fursblade, Isaac Davis, John Charles Coble, the unidentified man from West 8th Street, the unidentified man from Southwestern Avenue, and Walter Holt, are confirmed. A 7th, Edwin Trujillo, may or may not exist, may or may not have died on Christmas Day 1986 in Santa Monica, may or may not be among the uncounted casualties of a man whose violence began earlier and extended further than the official record can definitively confirm. Christopher Fursblade was 40 years old. He was a person with a life that preceded the night Joseph Danks found him on Vermont Avenue. With whatever personal history, whatever relationships, whatever specific qualities and characteristics defined him as an individual human being. He was not a symbol. He was not a statistic. He was a man who deserved to see January 7th. He did not. Isaac Davis was 58 years old. John Charles Coble was 55. Amand Lord, who survived the attack and whose fierce, unexpected resistance may have saved his own life and contributed, through his subsequent description of his attacker, to the eventual identification of Danks, was 64 and possessed a courage in that terrible moment that deserves acknowledgement. James Lyons was 58 and also survived the assault on his life. The unnamed man on West 8th Street and the unnamed man on Southwestern Avenue deserve to be mourned even without the names that would make their mourning more concrete. Walter Holt was 67 years old when Joseph Danks wrapped a ligature around his neck while he slept. Walter Holt was already in prison, already stripped of his freedom, already in circumstances that had removed him from the ordinary protections available to people living in the wider world. He was in a place that was supposed to be managed, controlled, operated by professionals whose responsibility included the safety of the people confined within its walls. He was asleep when he died. He posed no threat. He was simply present in a space that someone else had decided he should not occupy. What made Joseph Danks? The question is not asked in order to excuse or diminish what he did. There is no diminishment possible. 6 lives, 7 perhaps, are gone because of him. 2 more people carry the memory of surviving his attacks, a memory that does not simply fade with the passage of years. The question is asked because understanding is not the same as absolution, and because the long, accumulating chronicle of Joseph Danks' life. The premature birth to an alcoholic teenager, the sedation, the drawer, the absent fathers, the head injuries, the untreated mental illness cycling through periods of institutional neglect and inadequate intervention, the sawed-off shotgun charge resolved with 5 years of probation, the homeless vagrancy, the festering paranoid contempt, constitutes a record of a person who was failed repeatedly, in ways large and small, by every system that encountered him before he acquired a kitchen knife. This is not a claim that every person subjected to similar deprivation becomes a killer. The vast majority do not. The majority of people born premature to substance-abusing parents, the majority of people who sustain head injuries, the majority of people diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, they do not go into the streets with knives. The relationship between disadvantage and violence is not deterministic. But the relationship is not entirely absent either, and willfully ignoring the conditions that shaped a person in order to simply categorize them as evil and move on does a disservice both to the complexity of human behavior and to the practical project of preventing future harm. The mental health system encountered Joseph Danks multiple times before January 1987. He was institutionalized briefly in the early 1980s, escaped, was recovered, received treatment, was released. He was observed exhibiting obvious and alarming symptoms of serious mental illness by family members, by police officers who encountered him in New Jersey and Florida and Michigan, by the legal system that processed his sawed-off shotgun arrest. And at each juncture, the intervention was insufficient, the follow-through was inadequate, the net designed to catch people in crisis had holes wide enough for a man in severe psychiatric distress to fall through entirely. By the time Danks arrived in Los Angeles in late 1986, he was a person in profound psychiatric crisis. Delusional, paranoid, homeless, and carrying within him a developing contempt for the homeless community whose company he was keeping and whose circumstances most closely mirrored his own. He had no mental health support. He had no housing stability. He had no connection to any service or institution that might have interrupted the trajectory he was on. He had a kitchen knife. The homeless men of Koreatown were among the most vulnerable individuals in one of the largest cities in the United States. They had few protections, few advocates, and, as the initial days of the killing spree demonstrated, limited visibility in the consciousness of a city that preferred not to look too closely at the suffering unfolding in its margins. Their deaths raised, briefly, the alarm they deserved. Their killer was caught, tried, convicted, and sentenced. But the conditions that placed both the killer and his victims in those dark Koreatown streets in January 1987, the conditions that stripped both the man with the knife and the men he murdered of the support and safety that might have prevented everything, those conditions were not resolved by the arrest of Joseph Danks. They persisted. They persist still. Danks remains on death row at San Quentin. His habeas appeals have been exhausted. His mental illness has continued without adequate treatment for most of his time in custody. He is in his early 60s now, the same general age range as several of the men he killed on those Koreatown streets, a cruel and meaningless arithmetic. He has spent the decades since his conviction constructing weapons in his cell, attacking guards, screaming through the night, conducting what appears from the outside to be a sustained internal war with a reality that his fractured mind cannot fully access or process. The men he killed have been gone for nearly 4 decades. Their names, those whose names we know, deserve to be spoken clearly and without the apologetic reduction that sometimes attends discussion of victims who were living on the margins. Christopher Michael Fursblade, Isaac Davis, John Charles Coble, Walter Holt, and the two men whose names the historical record never recovered, whose identities dissolved into the anonymity that had surrounded them in life and followed them into death. They all mattered. They all deserved more than what January 1987 gave them. The Koreatown Slasher. The Ghost of Vermont Avenue. The names given to Joseph Martin Danks by a city trying to make sense of what moved through its streets in those cold January nights are the kinds of names that attach to cases like this, evocative shorthand for a horror that actual names and facts and stories can only partially contain. But behind those headline-ready epithets is the truth of a thing more complicated and more disturbing than any label can adequately hold. A man who was broken before he was ever whole, who moved through a world that consistently failed to catch him, and who took his rage and his contempt and his knife into the streets and used them against the people least equipped to protect themselves from him. The case is closed in the legal sense. The verdicts are final. The appeals are exhausted. The sentence stands. And somewhere in San Quentin, Joseph Martin Danks breathes and sleeps and screams in the night and constructs his weapons and waits for a death that the state has promised him but not yet delivered. For the men whose lives he ended, the accounting was settled long ago. Their part in this story concluded on the streets of Koreatown, on a southwestern avenue sidewalk, in a cell in Tehachapi. They did not choose any of it. They were simply there, in the wrong place at the worst possible time, in the path of a man who had decided that their lives were expendable. They were not. They never were. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Road Bleeds South, Jeffrey Joseph Daugherty, a.k.a. the Highway Ghost. He left no witnesses. He left no mercy. He left only bodies. Some men are broken by the world before the world ever gets a chance to know their name, and Jeffrey Joseph Daugherty made certain the world would never forget it. Picture this. It is the winter of 1976. America is celebrating its bicentennial year, 200 years of freedom, of promise, of the open road. Across the highways and back roads of this nation, a battered car is rolling south and then north again, cutting through Florida sunshine and Pennsylvania frost, carrying inside it something the passengers' faces would never betray to a passing stranger. There is a young man at the wheel, 20 years old, lean and quiet, with eyes that prosecutors would later describe as possessing no warmth whatsoever, no flicker, no hesitation, no recognizable human remorse. Beside him sits a woman more than twice his age, a woman who would walk free from prison 11 years later, while 5 families buried their dead and waited for answers that justice never fully delivered. And somewhere between Michigan and the end of the line, this young man, this product of abandonment, neglect, and inherited violence, decided that human life was simply a liability he could not afford to leave breathing. He robbed, he shot, he stabbed, he drove on, he did it again, then he did it again after that, and he called it freedom. What you are about to hear is not a comfortable story. It does not resolve neatly. It does not offer the closure we are trained to expect from courtroom dramas or documentary films. It offers something rawer, more unsettling, and ultimately more honest, because the truth of Jeffrey Joseph Daugherty is not simply the truth of a killer. It is the truth of a system that kept him alive for 12 years after his sentence, of a woman who shared his car and possibly his choices and nonetheless walked out of prison into anonymity, and of 5 human beings who deserved far more from their last moments on this earth than what this man gave them. This is their story too. And it begins the way the worst things always do, quietly on an ordinary road, in the dead of an otherwise unremarkable winter. There is a particular kind of damage that happens to a child in silence, without bruises visible enough to photograph or wounds dramatic enough to document in a police report. It happens in the absence of a mother's voice at breakfast. It happens in the empty chair at a school play. It happens when a child looks up at the man who is supposed to be his father and sees not love, not protection, not guidance, but a drifting, unstable stranger whose primary relationship with the world is one of pure self-interest. Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty entered this world on September 26, 1955, in Detroit, Michigan, and the world he entered was already broken before he took his first breath. His mother abandoned him before he could form a memory of her face. He was 2 years old, barely past the stage of learning to walk, when she disappeared from his life with the kind of finality that leaves no room for explanation. No forwarding address, no birthday cards tucked under a door. He was handed to his grandparents, and while that arrangement may have provided roof and food, it could not substitute for the specific gravity of a parent who chose to stay. The absence of that choice. The knowledge, absorbed wordlessly by a child's developing mind, that his own mother had decided he was not worth remaining for, would become a wound that never properly scarred over. His father was present in the way a ghost is present, detectable, occasionally visible, fundamentally unreachable. The man was a drifter by nature and a drunk by practice, someone who wandered between marriages the way others wander between cities. 5 times in total, each union another chapter in a story defined by instability. He had spent time in psychiatric institutions. He had a prior criminal record specifically for child abuse, a detail so darkly ironic given the son he produced that it seems almost too perfectly terrible to be real. He was, in the most clinical sense, completely unequipped to be anyone's father, and yet he was Jeffrey's, and Jeffrey knew it, and carried that knowledge like a stone pressed flat against his chest. By the time Jeffrey Dougherty reached adulthood, he had constructed what passed for a conventional life. A marriage, 2 children, the architecture of normalcy, but whatever internal framework holds such a life together had never properly formed in him. The marriage ended in divorce. He was 20 years old and already accumulating losses, and there is something deeply significant about that number, 20, which is how old he was when he decided that the fastest way out of his mounting problems was not work, not reconciliation, not any of the difficult and quiet paths that most people navigate, but rather something far more brutal and irreversible. In January of 1976, Jeffrey Dougherty packed whatever was necessary and left Michigan. He did not leave alone. With him was Bonnie Jean Heath, his girlfriend, a woman of 41 years, which meant that when Dougherty was a toddler being abandoned by his mother, Bonnie Heath was already a grown adult navigating the world. Their relationship was, by any conventional measure, profoundly strange. She was more than 2 decades his senior. She had children of her own. And yet the two of them had formed some kind of gravitational bond that neither seemed capable of escaping, even as the events of the following weeks would pull both of them toward consequences of utterly different magnitudes. Also in the vehicle was Dougherty's uncle, a peripheral figure who would testify at trial but whose own culpability was never fully established in the public record. Their stated reason for the southward drive was innocuous enough: looking for work, visiting Heath's children in Florida. It is the kind of excuse that sounds reasonable in daylight on a clear road before anything has happened. But the money ran out. That is the detail that surfaces repeatedly in every account of what followed. Not ideology, not calculated predation, not the elaborate psychological architecture of the textbook serial killer, but simple, grinding financial desperation colliding with something far darker already living inside Jeffrey Dougherty. When the money ran out, the robberies began. It is worth pausing here to consider what it means to begin a robbery spree. There is a moment, a precise, invisible moment, before the first criminal act in which a person still has the capacity to choose otherwise. Dougherty crossed that threshold somewhere on the road south, and once he crossed it, the momentum of what followed became very difficult to interrupt. Robberies require victims. Victims are people. People can identify you. And for Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty, who would later be described by a Pennsylvania prosecutor as the most amoral individual he had ever encountered in his career, the solution to that problem was not to disguise himself more effectively or to plan more carefully. It was something far more absolute. He left no witnesses. That phrase, small, flat, devastating, is the lens through which everything that happened between February 23rd and March 11th, 1976, must be understood. Not a spree driven by rage in the traditional sense. Not a predator selecting victims according to some elaborate typology. Rather, a young man moving through the landscape of ordinary American commerce, convenience stores, gas stations, a pizza parlor, and making a decision each time that the person behind the counter, the person on the road, the person who happened to be present at the wrong moment, simply could not be permitted to leave the encounter with enough breath left in their body to describe him. It is a logic so cold that it almost defies emotional comprehension. Almost. The first killing that authorities could definitively pin to Dougherty occurred on February 23, 1976, at Hammock in Flagler County, Florida. But there are whispers, credible whispers, the kind backed by a district attorney's public statement, that the violence may have begun even before Florida, in a small city in Alabama called Demopolis. A local businessman was robbed and killed there on February 19, 1976. The DA of Demopolis would later tell reporters that Bonnie Heath had identified Dougherty as the triggerman. But with Dougherty already sitting on death row in Florida, and with the evidentiary trail too thin to sustain a prosecution, no charges were ever filed. The businessman's name drifted out of the headlines and into the long silence that swallows the victims of killers who get caught for something else first. Whether or not Alabama was the true beginning, Florida was where the documented horror commenced. And it commenced without any particular warning to a 68-year-old woman working behind the counter of an Easy Way food store in Flagler County, who had no reason whatsoever on that February morning to believe that the young man who walked through her door intended to leave her dead on her own floor. Her name was Carmen Abrams. She was 68 years old. She had a husband, a man who was present that day, who would absorb 4 gunshots and somehow survive, who would carry both the physical scars and the memory of watching his wife die for the rest of whatever life remained to him. Carmen Abrams was shot in the head. The robbery netted Dougherty whatever cash was in the register. It was not much. It was never much. And yet the cost paid in human life was catastrophic and permanent and entirely irreversible, and Dougherty and Heath got back into their car and drove away. That detail, the driving away, is one of the most chilling recurring elements of this entire story. 5 times across 2 states, across a span of approximately 16 days, this pair would stop, take, destroy, and continue. There was no apparent anguish recorded in Dougherty's behavior between crimes. There were no dramatic breakdowns, no moments of turning the car around. Just the road unspooling ahead of them and the next town and the next need for money and the next person who would pay for it with everything they had. The investigators who would later piece this timeline together, drawing lines between Flagler County and Volusia County and Brevard County and then the long northward drive into Pennsylvania, must have been struck by the almost mundane geography of it. This was not a hidden landscape. This was not the wilderness or the night. These crimes happened in ordinary commercial spaces, in the middle of ordinary American days, in places where people went to buy groceries and gas and pizza and expected to return home afterward. The violation of that ordinary expectation is part of what makes the Dougherty case so persistently disturbing. Not the exoticism of it, but its utter normality of setting, against which the violence reads as all the more obscene. By the time Carmen Abrams was buried in Flagler County, Jeffrey Dougherty had not yet finished. He was still driving, still running low on money, still accompanied by a woman who later told courts dramatically different stories about her own role depending on which courtroom she was standing in and what deal was on the table. And Florida, flat, winter warm, indifferent, still stretched ahead of them, full of ordinary people who would never see him coming. What makes Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty different from the vast majority of violent criminals is not the scale of what he did. 5 confirmed killings is horrifying but not historically singular, nor the method, nor even the brevity of the spree itself. What makes him stand apart, and what lodged his name in the memories of investigators, prosecutors, and crime historians across decades, is the combination of his age, his apparent emotional vacancy, and the peculiar domestic quality of his accomplice arrangement. He was 20 years old. She was 41. They were, in some grotesque parody of normalcy, a couple on a road trip, stopping to eat, to sleep, to fuel the car, and to murder the occasional stranger who happened to occupy the space they needed to rob. Pennsylvania prosecutor Thomas Peoples, who spent considerable time in Dougherty's presence during the trial proceedings, told reporters afterward that he had never in his career encountered a human being so completely untethered from any recognizable sense of human connection. He had no feeling for anyone other than Bonnie Heath, people said. And even that feeling, whatever it was, had somehow not prevented him from pulling a trigger in Heath's presence repeatedly, from leaving bodies behind while she sat nearby, from conducting these executions as casually as another man might conduct a transaction at a bank counter. The roots of that vacancy run deep, back through the abandoned childhood and the alcoholic father and the grandparents' home in Detroit, where a small boy learned early that the people responsible for loving you might simply choose not to show up. It does not excuse a single one of the 5 deaths that followed. Nothing could excuse them, but it does suggest that Jeffrey Doherty did not emerge from a vacuum. That he was, in some measure, assembled by circumstances before he began assembling circumstances of his own. That is not mitigation. It is simply the disturbing and unavoidable context of a life that ended in an electric chair at the age of 33, having never quite managed to become whatever it might otherwise have been. The road south was still warm. The winter was mild. And Carmen Abrams' husband lay in a hospital bed in Flagler County, for bullets in his body, trying to understand what had just happened to the life he and his wife had built together. Doherty drove on. There is a cruelty particular to the month of March in Florida that has nothing to do with weather. The sun remains generous, the air stays mild, and the landscape offers nothing by way of dramatic warning. No early darkness, no biting cold, no atmospheric signal that something terrible is moving through it. In March of 1976, that something was Jeffrey Joseph Doherty, 20 years old, broke, and apparently possessed of an almost clinical capacity to look at another human being's face and see in it nothing worth preserving. 6 days elapsed between the death of Carmen Abrams in Flagler County and the next chapter of what investigators would eventually reconstruct as a methodical and accelerating pattern of lethal robbery. 6 days in which Doherty continued to exist in the world. Eating, sleeping, driving, occupying motel rooms, filling the gas tank, as though nothing had happened, as though the woman he had shot in the head in an Easy Way food store was simply a transaction completed and filed. 6 days in which Bonnie Heath sat beside him and did not go to a police station, did not make a phone call, did not flag down a highway patrol vehicle on the interstate and speak the words that might have prevented what was coming. Whatever her reasons, fear, complicity, devotion, calculation, she did not stop it. And on March 1st, 1976, the killing resumed. It resumed on a road near Melbourne, in Brevard County, on an ordinary afternoon, with a 49-year-old woman standing at the side of the road with her thumb out. Her name was Lavon Patricia Saylor. She was hitchhiking, a common enough practice in 1976, before decades of documented danger gradually shifted public perception of the act, and when a car stopped for her, she got in. She had no way of knowing who was driving. She had no way of reading the particular blankness behind the young man's eyes, no instrument for detecting the coldness that prosecutor after prosecutor and investigator after investigator would later struggle to articulate in courtroom language. She was a woman trying to get somewhere. She got into the car. Doherty and Heath drove her away from Melbourne, away from the highway's visibility and the peripheral awareness of other motorists, toward an area near the Brevard County landfill. A place chosen not for any symbolic reason but for the most functional one imaginable. Isolation. No witnesses, no passing cars, no one within earshot of what was about to happen. When they arrived at this desolate location, Doherty ordered Lavon Saylor out of the vehicle. He robbed her. The total taken was $12 and some articles of clothing. $12. Whatever dignity remained to the transaction, and there was essentially none, ended there. Then he shot her 5 times in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol at close range. The forensic details of that particular act, the proximity, the caliber, the number of rounds, tell a story that the clinical language of court documents cannot fully convey. This was not a panicked shot fired in the escalating chaos of a robbery gone wrong. This was deliberate. This was thorough. This was a man who had already done this once, who had watched a body fall in Flagler County and driven away without apparent difficulty, and who now applied the same logic with the same methodical calm. Leave no witnesses. 5 shots. Into the back of the head. Close range. Lavon Saylor died near the Brevard County dump. In the dirt, $12 lighter and a continent away from whatever it was she had been trying to reach when she put her thumb out on that Melbourne road. Doherty later, at trial, would attempt to distribute responsibility for this death. In a taped statement introduced by prosecutors, he pointed at Bonnie Heath, claimed she had instructed him to leave no witnesses, claimed that as far as he was concerned her finger had been on the trigger alongside his. "I thought I'd done enough," Doherty said in that recording, but Bonnie said to shoot her again. The prosecution's response to this was essentially that Doherty's own conflicting accounts. He had told Pennsylvania authorities that Heath played no role in the killings, then pivoted to blaming her in Florida proceedings, made him an unreliable narrator of his own crimes. The state attorney ultimately concluded that while Heath had been present at the center of every atrocity this pair committed, making a capital case against her independently was not achievable given the evidentiary contradictions Doherty himself had created. So Heath escaped the death sentence, and Levon Saylor remained dead regardless. What happened next, on the same day, March 1st, 1976, demonstrates something about Doherty's psychological state during this period that is genuinely difficult to process. Most people, after committing the act he had just committed near the Brevard County landfill, would be in some measurable state of disruption, adrenaline crash, physical shock, the accumulated weight of having taken 2 lives in less than 2 weeks. Jeffrey Doherty was apparently not most people. On the same afternoon, the same day he left Levon Saylor's body in the dirt near a dump, Doherty drove to Edgewater, in Volusia County, and entered a small business called Betty's Pizza Parlor. Betty Campbell was 50 years old. She was a co-owner of that establishment, a woman who had built something modest and real in the community of Edgewater. A pizza parlor with her name on it, a place where people came to eat and she fed them, a small ordinary corner of commerce that asked nothing of the world beyond basic decency and reasonable custom. She was in the kitchen area when Doherty entered. What followed was a robbery that turned savage with a speed and finality that suggests Doherty had by this point fully normalized the act of ending a human life in the course of taking money. He did not shoot Betty Campbell. The weapon this time was a blade. He beat her. He stabbed her. He killed her in the kitchen of her own restaurant, a kitchen that was almost certainly still carrying the ambient warmth and smell of whatever she had been preparing before this stranger arrived. Her husband would later be the one to find her there. Think about that for a moment. The specific, irreparable devastation of walking into the place your wife built with her hands, calling her name, moving toward the kitchen, and finding her on the floor. Whatever Betty Campbell's husband felt in that moment is beyond the range of language to adequately address, and we will not insult it by trying too hard to translate it into words. Her purse was taken. It contained a .25 caliber automatic handgun, her credit cards, and an unemployment check. The purse was later recovered along Route 1, north of New Smyrna Beach, discarded on the roadside like litter, the physical remnant of everything Betty Campbell had with her when her life ended, scattered on an asphalt shoulder without ceremony. 2 murders on one day, 2 separate victims in 2 separate counties by 2 separate methods, a gun near a landfill, a blade in a kitchen. Doherty left both scenes. He left both counties. He left Florida entirely, driving north with Bonnie Heath toward Pennsylvania, toward his father's old territory, toward the Blair County towns where the next chapter of this nightmare would play out against a backdrop of late winter Pennsylvania gray. It is worth pausing to consider the victims of this Florida period as individual human beings, because the velocity of the events, 5 killings in 16 days across 2 states and multiple counties, with multiple law enforcement jurisdictions initially unaware of their connections to each other, creates a narrative momentum that can inadvertently flatten the individuality of those who died. Carmen Abrams was 68 years old. She was working a job. She was with her husband. She was doing what ordinary people do in ordinary stores on ordinary mornings, and she was shot for whatever was in the register. Levon Saylor was 49 years old. She was trying to get somewhere. She accepted a ride. She was robbed of $12 and then shot 5 times in the back of the head because the man who had taken her $12 had decided that $12 was worth more than her continued existence as a breathing, living person. Betty Campbell was 50 years old. She had built a business. She was in her kitchen. She was killed with a blade and found by her husband on the floor of the place she had created. 3 women, 3 lives fully formed, with histories and relationships and futures they had every reason to expect. All of them ended within the space of 6 days by a 20-year-old man who spoke afterward about freedom and journey and the road ahead with what every account describes as a striking absence of anything resembling guilt. The law enforcement response to these crimes was complicated initially by exactly the kind of jurisdictional fragmentation that has historically given mobile killers their most significant operational advantage. Flagler County had the Abrams shooting. Brevard County had the Saylor homicide. Volusia County had Betty Campbell's murder. Each jurisdiction had its own investigators, its own case files, its own timeline. The connections between these crimes were not immediately apparent. Same general time period, yes, but different counties, different weapons, different victim profiles. It took the collective gravitational pull of accumulating evidence, the work of investigators like Sheriff Ed Duff of Volusia County and his detective Art Dees, and the eventual arrest that was still 12 days away to pull these separate tragedies into a single coherent picture. Doherty, meanwhile, was on the highway. Pennsylvania lay ahead of him. The car was moving. The money was already running out again. There is a detail from this period that investigators and legal scholars have returned to repeatedly over the years, the sheer audacity, or perhaps the more troubling word is indifference, with which Doherty operated. He was not hiding in remote locations between crimes. He was not using elaborate disguises. He was not exhibiting the kind of careful operational security that premeditated, long-term killers typically employ. He was simply moving through public spaces, through commercial establishments, through the landscape of ordinary American life, and killing when the calculation demanded it and driving away. The absence of concealment speaks to something about his self-perception during this period. Either he did not believe he would be caught, or he did not particularly care. Given what he said at his execution 12 years later, I look at this as freedom, delivered with an almost serene composure. It is difficult to dismiss the second possibility entirely. The Florida State Police would eventually piece together his trail. The Virginia State Police would eventually intercept him. But before any of that happened, Pennsylvania would add 2 more names to the list of people who had the catastrophic misfortune of being in the same commercial space as Jeffrey Joseph Doherty when he needed money. He crossed the state line. The weather turned cold. The landscape shifted from Florida's flat warmth to Pennsylvania's bleak, bare tree winter. And somewhere inside the car, in the silence between 2 people who knew exactly what they had done together, the road kept passing beneath the wheels like nothing in the world was wrong at all. Blair County, Pennsylvania, in early March sits under skies that have not yet decided whether to become spring. The trees are still skeletal. The ground has the compressed, lightless quality of earth that has endured months of cold and is not yet ready to release it. The small cities and townships of that region, Altoona, Hollidaysburg, Duncansville, carry the particular texture of mid-century industrial Pennsylvania. Modest, working, defined by the ordinary rhythms of people who show up for their shifts and tend their families and ask relatively little of the universe beyond the reasonable expectation of safety in their own communities. Jeffrey Doherty's father had roots in Altoona. That detail, seemingly minor, almost incidental, is worth sitting with for a moment. The man who had spent Doherty's entire childhood being absent, unstable, and episodically abusive had left behind in this region some kind of geographic footprint, and Doherty drove toward it across the winter highways as though returning to a place of origin. There is no clean psychological conclusion to draw from this. It is simply a fact, and facts in this case have a habit of arriving loaded with implications that resist easy interpretation. On March 4, 1976, before the murders that would follow, Rich's music store in Altoona was robbed. The robbery was violent enough to enter the investigative record and would eventually contribute to the charge sheet that followed Doherty's arrest. Heath was convicted in Pennsylvania of second-degree murder in connection with the subsequent killings as well as this robbery. One of several Pennsylvania convictions that the Supreme Court of that state would later complicate by ordering retrials, trials which ultimately never occurred because Heath had been moved to Florida to face separate proceedings there. But the robbery of the music store was a prelude. 5 days later, on March 9, 1976, the killing resumed. The location was a convenience store in Hollidaysburg. The victim was Elizabeth Shanks, also rendered in some documents as Elizabeth Shank, who was 28 years old and working a shift behind the counter. She was young. She was doing her job. She was, by every account, precisely the kind of person that the criminal justice system's language of innocent victims was designed to describe, though that designation does them all a quiet disservice by reducing their individuality to their status as targets. Elizabeth Shanks was 28 years old. She had her whole life arranged in whatever configuration 28-year-olds arrange their lives, whatever relationships, whatever plans, whatever ordinary expectations about tomorrow that the 28th year of a life tends to carry. Doherty entered the store armed. He committed the robbery, and then he shot Elizabeth Shanks 5 times in the head. 5 times. Again. The same number as Carmen Abrams in Flagler County. The same number as Levon Saylor near the Brevard County dump. There is a terrible consistency to this, the same caliber, the same approximate proximity, the same application of 5 rounds to a human head with the same mechanical thoroughness. Investigators and prosecutors would later describe this pattern when building the case for the death penalty's aggravating circumstances. The consistency itself. The fact that this was clearly not panic, not accident, not the terrible overcorrection of a first-time criminal who suddenly realizes the situation has escalated beyond control, was part of what made the case so damning. This was method. This was practice. This was a young man who had learned, across 4 prior murders, exactly how he preferred to end a life, and was applying that preference with something approaching expertise. Elizabeth Shanks died in a convenience store in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania, for whatever was in the register. Blair County investigators were immediately involved, and the regional law enforcement community in that part of Pennsylvania began the work of connecting the dots between this killing and the music store robbery 5 days earlier. They did not yet know about Florida. They did not yet know about the 3 women who had died in the sunshine while Doherty was still moving north. That picture would only become complete after the arrest, which was now 2 days away, though Doherty himself gave no sign of being aware that the net was tightening. 2 days. One more murder. On March 11, 1976, Jeffrey Doherty drove to Duncansville in Blair County and stopped at a gas station. The attendant on duty was George Carnes. He was 18 years old. Younger than the crime itself would feel to those who investigated it, younger than the distance between his death and the moment you are reading these words. George Carnes was a teenager doing a shift at a gas station on an ordinary winter day in central Pennsylvania. He did not know what kind of man had just pulled up to his station. He could not have known. Doherty robbed the gas station. He shot George Carnes 5 times in the head. George Carnes died instantly. 5 times. The 5th victim. 5 shots. The precision of the repetition is itself a form of horror. Not just the deaths, but the pattern, the evidence of a mind that had developed a preferred approach to silencing a human being and applied it with the same reliable efficiency each time. Investigators who worked the Blair County cases would describe the crime scenes with a kind of weighted brevity in their official reports, as though the language available to them was simply not sufficient to carry the full weight of what they were documenting. George Carnes was the last person Jeffrey Doherty killed. Not because something within him stopped. There is no evidence of that, no documented moment of remorse or hesitation or turning back. He was stopped by external forces, by the accumulated weight of evidence and interagency cooperation that was closing the distance behind him. One day after George Carnes died in Duncansville, on March 12, 1976, Virginia State Police Trooper E.W. Hawkins intercepted Jeffrey Doherty and Bonnie Heath in Buckingham County, Virginia. The arrest was made. The road trip that had begun with a southbound drive from Michigan in January ended on a Virginia highway with the 2 of them in handcuffs. It is worth considering what that moment must have felt like for the law enforcement officers involved, the Virginia trooper who made the stop, the Blair County investigators who had been piecing together the Pennsylvania murders, the Florida County sheriffs who had been working their own cases without yet knowing about the full picture. When the arrest came through and the connections began to emerge. This couple, these 2 people, these 5 deaths across 2 states and possibly 1 more in Alabama, the scale of it must have landed with a particular weight. Not the shocking scale of the most headline-consuming serial murder cases, but the dense, accumulated weight of specific individuals. Carmen, 68. Levon, 49. Betty, 50. Elizabeth, 28. George, 18. A span of 34 years between youngest and oldest victim. 5 separate ordinary days destroyed. The legal machinery that followed the arrest was extensive, protracted, and, particularly in its treatment of Bonnie Heath, deeply contested. Dougherty was processed through a Virginia armed robbery charge first, receiving 18 years for crimes committed in that state. He was then transferred to Pennsylvania, where the Blair County prosecutions began in late 1976. The trial for the murder of Elizabeth Shanks came first. December 1976, a Blair County jury, a guilty verdict, a sentence of life imprisonment. The trial for the murder of George Carnes followed in January 1977. Another guilty verdict. This time, the jury recommended death. Dougherty was sentenced to die in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court later vacated that death sentence and remanded the Carnes case for retrial. He was never retried for Carnes. The life sentence for Shanks remained. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's intervention had the practical effect of shifting the primary venue for capital punishment proceedings to Florida, where 3 murders awaited trial and where prosecutors had already signaled their intention to seek the death penalty with considerable vigor. It was in this legal context that the strange, troubling story of Bonnie Heath's accountability, or the carefully managed absence of it, played out with a clarity that infuriated many of the people closest to these cases. Heath was Dougherty's constant companion throughout every murder. She was present at every crime scene. She drove the same car, slept in the same rooms, crossed the same state lines. Pennsylvania juries convicted her of second-degree murder in 2 of the killings, but the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ordered retrials on those convictions. Retrials that never occurred because by that point Heath had been transferred to Florida for separate proceedings. In Florida, she was convicted of second-degree murder in 2 of the 3 Florida homicides and received consecutive 25-year sentences. She was released from Florida Correctional Institution on July 10, 1987, more than a year before the man who wielded the weapon in every case was finally executed. Her current whereabouts, as of the time of this research, remain undocumented. The state attorney who prosecuted the Florida cases, Norm Wolfinger, told reporters plainly that he did not believe justice had been fully served where Heath was concerned. She certainly was in the midst of all these homicides, Wolfinger said. He acknowledged the prosecutorial decision to focus on Dougherty for the death penalty rather than risk undermining the case against both of them. It was a pragmatic legal calculation, and it resulted in Dougherty on death row and Heath eventually walking free into a life about which the public record is essentially silent. Pennsylvania prosecutor Thomas Peoples offered perhaps the most direct characterization of Dougherty that exists in the public record: the most amoral individual I ever met. Not the most violent, not the most dangerous, though he was certainly both. The most amoral. The one most completely absent of the moral architecture that most human beings, however imperfectly, carry within them as some basic orientation toward other people's right to exist. It is a description that sits uncomfortably in the mind afterward, because it suggests not so much a person who made terrible choices as a person who operated from a baseline so different from ordinary human experience that the concept of choice itself had a different meaning for him. 5 people were dead across 2 states. A woman who had been present for all of it was processing her conviction in a Florida correctional facility. And Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty was beginning the long, litigated passage through the appeals system that would consume the next 12 years of his life and end on a specific afternoon in November 1988, in a room at Florida State Prison that contained an electric chair that had been in use for 65 years. The road had finally run out of miles. 12 years is a long time to wait for something you know is coming. It is long enough to watch a child grow from infancy to adolescence. It is long enough for the world outside the prison walls to change its music and its fashions and its political configurations beyond comfortable recognition. It is long enough for the specific texture of 1976, the year of the bicentennial of highway robberies and easy-way food stores and hitchhikers on Melbourne roads, to soften at the edges and acquire the particular patina of the past, of something that happened to a different country in a different era. For Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty, those 12 years were spent navigating the labyrinthine structure of American capital appeals, state Supreme Courts and federal circuit courts, and ultimately the United States Supreme Court itself, which weighed his fate not once but multiple times across that span. He was tried in Florida in a series of proceedings that moved through the early 1980s with the deliberate pace that capital cases require. The first Florida trial addressed the murder of Betty Campbell, the pizzeria killing, the stabbing in the kitchen, the purse found on Route 1. Guilty. Life imprisonment, to run consecutively with the Pennsylvania and Virginia sentences that were already piling up behind his name in the official record. The second Florida trial addressed the murder of Carmen Abrams, the convenience store shooting in Flagler County, the first documented killing of the spree. Guilty. Another life sentence. By 1980, Jeffrey Daugherty had accumulated enough consecutive life sentences that the purely mathematical exercise of calculating his theoretical release date had become an abstraction with no connection to any conceivable reality. He was going to die in custody. The only remaining question was whether that death would come of natural causes or through the deliberate application of electric current in a specifically designed room at Florida State Prison in Stark. The third Florida trial, the one for the murder of Levon Saylor, was the one that answered that question. Levon Saylor's case had particular prosecutorial weight. It combined first-degree murder with kidnapping and robbery charges, and the manner of her death. Driven to an isolated location, ordered out of a vehicle, robbed of $12, shot 5 times in the back of the head, contained what the Florida courts would categorize as the aggravating factor of being especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Daugherty entered a guilty plea to the charges. A jury was convened for the sentencing phase alone. The jury recommended death. The judge imposed it. The Florida Supreme Court was asked to review and affirm, and in September 1982 it did precisely that. The appeals that followed over the next 6 years are documented in the dry, procedural language of court records and legal filings, but what they represent in human terms is a man fighting against the date of his own death with every legal instrument available to him, arguing that prior convictions had been improperly used as aggravating factors, that various constitutional protections had been violated, that new grounds for relief had emerged. The Florida Supreme Court rejected his first appeal in 1982. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene in 1984. The Florida Supreme Court rejected a second appeal in April 1987. On the same day, it rejected the appeals of 2 other convicted murderers. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals turned down his case in February 1988. The U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition. The execution date was set. Originally scheduled for October 15, 1987, it had been postponed by the 11th Circuit while appeals were still pending. When those appeals finally ran out, a new date was chosen, November 7, 1988. On that Monday, in the hours before the execution, Jeffrey Daugherty spent time with 3 people who had been part of his life before all of this: his ex-wife Deborah, his 16-year-old son Barry, and his 13-year-old daughter Stacy, who had traveled from Michigan for this particular and terrible appointment with their father's death. His father was also present, the drifting, 5 times married, institutionalized, abuse-convicted man whose absence had been the foundational wound of Jeffrey's childhood, now present for the final hours with root beer and ice cream. A small, almost unbearably poignant gesture, as though trying in the last available moments to offer something he had never managed to provide across all the years of his son's formation. Root beer and ice cream. Daugherty declined the traditional last meal but accepted those from his father. It is the kind of detail that does not fit neatly into any of the available narratives about this case. Neither the pure monster framing nor the pure sympathy framing, but something genuinely human and genuinely sad, existing quietly alongside everything else that was irredeemable about what Jeffrey Daugherty had done. Outside the prison at Stark, a small vigil had gathered. Death penalty opponents, some carrying signs, stood in the dark outside the walls of Florida State Prison. Among them was actress Margot Kidder, whose presence drew a handful of additional press cameras. The signs read, "Stop State Murder," and "Orlando Citizens Against Execution." It was a modest gathering, not the enormous demonstrations that would accompany the execution of Ted Bundy, whose own date with the same institution was now only approximately 3 months away. That proximity. Daugherty executed on November 7, 1988, Bundy to follow on January 24, 1989, is one of those historical coincidences that feels almost too neatly arranged to be accidental, though of course it was. Both men had committed their crimes in 1976. Both had spent over a decade in the same Florida prison system. Both were about to be executed within months of each other. The difference in their public profiles was enormous. Bundy had become a kind of grotesque cultural phenomenon, his charisma and the theatrical dimensions of his trial generating a media industry that continues to this day. Dougherty was far less known outside the counties where he had killed and the legal proceedings that followed. He was the 19th person to be executed in Florida after the reinstatement of capital punishment, and he would be briefly overshadowed in the public memory by the much more famous inmate who followed him to the same chair. That obscurity is itself a kind of injustice to his victims. Not to Dougherty, but to Carmen, Levon, Betty, Elizabeth, and George, who deserved their deaths to be remembered with at least the weight of public record, not crowded out by the more cinematically compelling story of the man who came after. At 5:16 in the afternoon on November 7, 1988, 2,000 volts of electric current passed through Jeffrey Joseph Dougherty's body for 2 minutes. He was 33 years old. He had delivered his final statement in the minutes before the switch was pulled, a sometimes rambling, sometimes defiant address in which he made several things clear. He was not going to perform remorse for the audience in the death chamber. He was going to frame his own death as a form of liberation. And he was going to speak to the other men on Florida's death row with an encouragement to keep fighting the system that he had just failed to successfully fight himself. "Some of you look at this as an execution," he said, his lips reportedly trembling slightly as he spoke. "I look at this as freedom. I've been in prison for 15 years, and now I'm free." He had converted to Catholicism at some point during his imprisonment, a fact that emerged at his 1980 trial when he told the court he would never take another human life, that only God possessed that right. It is difficult to know what to do with that statement in retrospect, given the 5 deaths that preceded his conversion and the apparent sincerity with which he delivered the sentiment. It is one of the many ways in which Jeffrey Dougherty resists the clean villain framing. Not because he was not responsible for terrible things, because he absolutely was, but because the human being who sat in that courtroom in 1980 was complicated in ways that simple evil narratives tend to erase. His body went still at 5:16 p.m. The witnesses in the room recorded it. The press outside reported it. Florida's 19th execution since the reinstatement of capital punishment was complete. Bonnie Jean Heath had been released from prison more than a year earlier, in July 1987. She walked out of Florida Correctional Institution carrying with her the consequences of second-degree murder convictions in 2 of the Florida slangs, a sentence structure that had allowed for release after serving what the system calculated as sufficient time. The prosecutor who had sent Dougherty to the electric chair acknowledged publicly that he did not believe justice had been fully served where Heath was concerned. The families of the victims had no vote in that calculation. The victims themselves, of course, had no voice left at all. George Carnes was 18 when he died. Had he lived, he would have been 30 in 1988, watching the evening news report on the execution of his killer. Betty Campbell's husband had found her on the floor of her own kitchen. Carmen Abrams' husband had survived 4 gunshots and watched his wife die in the store where they worked together. Levon Saylor's family had spent 12 years knowing that the man who shot their loved one 5 times in the back of the head for $12 was alive in a Florida prison, filing appeals, arguing constitutional law, watching years pass. Elizabeth Shanks was 28. Whatever the remainder of her life might have contained, relationship, children, accomplishment, simple, ordinary joy, none of it was available to her after March 9, 1976, in a convenience store in Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. The electric chair at Florida State Prison had been built 65 years before it claimed Dougherty. It was, by 1988, a piece of machinery with considerable history behind it, having processed the passage of 18 individuals through death before his name was added to the roster. The chair itself is unremarkable in appearance. Wood, metal restraints, the functional vocabulary of institutionalized execution. Its significance is entirely in what it represents and what it has witnessed, and on November 7, 1988, what it witnessed was the end of a journey that had begun in a Detroit childhood defined by abandonment, traveled through an Alabama roadside and a Florida convenience store and a pizza parlor kitchen and a Pennsylvania convenience store and a Pennsylvania gas station, and concluded here, in this specific room at this specific hour with 2,000 volts and 2 minutes and a man who described the whole thing as freedom. Whether it was freedom, whether there is anything meaningful in that framing at all, is a question that exists in territory beyond the reach of legal documents or crime reporting or any narrative form that claims to trade in facts. What exists within the reach of facts is this: 5 people died because Jeffrey Joseph Doherty decided their lives were worth less than the contents of a register or a wallet or a purse. 5 families carried grief that predated his death by 12 years and continued long after it. And Bonnie Jean Heath, who shared the car and the road and the terrible logic of leave no witnesses, walked free into a life about which the world has heard essentially nothing since 1987. The case remains, in the memory of Blair County and Flagler County and Brevard County and Volusia County, one of those episodes that a community absorbs into its collective history without quite being able to fully metabolize. Too specific to forget, too painful to dwell on, too morally complicated in its aftermath to offer the kind of resolution that allows a story to fully close. The victims' names are preserved in court records and case files and the digital repositories of true crime research. Their lives were far more than court documents and case numbers, and whatever this story can offer as tribute to that larger truth is inadequate by definition. What it can offer, at minimum, is this: their names spoken clearly and with full attention to who they were as human beings rather than as data points in a murderer's biography. Carmen Abrams, Lavon Patricia Saylor, Betty Campbell, Elizabeth Shanks, George Carnes. 5 people, 5 ordinary days destroyed. 5 sets of survivors left to navigate a world permanently altered by a 20-year-old man driving south in January 1976 with a girlfriend twice his age and a gun and a need for money and an almost complete absence of whatever it is that prevents most people from doing what he did. The road ran out of miles on November 7, 1988, at 5:16 p.m. in Stark, Florida. The chair was empty again by 5:18. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.